Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of The Voice of Neuro. We're doing World Discussion with Agent Smith once again. It is December the 15th, 9 p.m. Seattle time, 11 something p.m. Texas time, and we are here to figure out what is going on in the world and what has happened in the past that is shaping the present and maybe some predictions about what could happen in the future. Welcome, Agent Smith. How are you doing this week?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Been pretty solid. It's been a nice week for me so far. I've had more of a normal human schedule, which is kind of unusual for how my rhythm tends to go sometimes, like waking up before noon and then going to bed when it's dark out. Can you imagine?
So adjusting then.
Yeah. I don't know how long it's going to stay like that, but for now I'm kind of enjoying being able to see the sun.
That can be good.
Mm-hmm. So some things that jumped out at me from these past 2 weeks, because last week I was asleep all of Sunday evening when we normally do this. Iran was a big deal, I think. Lots of protests, sanctions and stuff. It seemed like things were hitting a sort of critical mass in a way.
Not really.
Not really.
No. I didn't even put it in my notes. No, what happened in Iran is that the government cut fuel subsidies. So I think it was like a 50% hike in the price. And that always sets people off, pretty much. I mean, a number of the protests around the world over the past 10 years have been related to cuts to fuel subsidies. That was one of the contributing factors to the Arab Spring, if I recall. Other than, the guy burning himself to death in protest, that obviously was sort of the genesis of the Arab Spring. But economic pressure was affecting a number of governments' finances, and a lot of them had to cut fuel subsidies and food subsidies as well. And that pressured budgets in a number of countries and aggravated the population, a lot of which didn't really think very highly of their governments anyway. So that's pretty much what's happening in Iran. The government's finances are under pressure, obviously, because of the sanctions. And in order to try to ameliorate that, they have cut subsidies to fuel. And predictably, a lot of people were pretty upset about it. But I don't think it's going to be like a real threat to the government. Generally, protests regarding fuel subsidies are kind of a flash in the pan. They start up and they'll last for a while and then they just kind of fizzle out. And if it's an authoritarian government, then they generally just ride it out. If it's a more democratic government, they might come to some kind of agreement to reverse the fuel subsidies, mitigate them, or maybe try to offset them somehow with some tax breaks for the people who are most vulnerable to them. But otherwise, generally they go through one way or the other. So I didn't really think much of it. It just kind of seemed like, okay, that's not great for the government's legitimacy in Iran, but it's not really a backbreaker either. They'll probably just kind of sail through it.
I did read some comments about this, and keep in mind this is Reddit comments, so probably not the most top shelf advice or knowledge, but they were discussing how sanctions affect a government, and the highest voted one was something about how sanctions put pressure, generally speaking, on the lower and middle classes. They don't really affect the people who are in charge, but it ends up motivating them, or at least making it more likely that they want to push for some change, maybe regime change, maybe give the alternative parties and stuff some more leverage to get power in their government and things like that. But it's kind of tricky because it doesn't usually directly punish the people who other governments are upset with. It's more of just putting pressure on the country as a whole, which eventually can lead to change, but it's pretty indirect pressure.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. It's not really an economic tool so much as a political tool. The idea is to undermine the popularity of the government and power by attaching an economic cost to supporting that government or to having that government be in power. So that can work if the government is very unpopular and there's an opposition that's strong enough to do something about it, maybe to change the government or at least to pressure it to significantly change its policies in a way that you, as the sanctioning country, would like. But it can be a problem if, say, the government is explicitly authoritarian, in which case they'll generally just invest more in repression in order to try to deflect any political pressure that may come from opponents. And even if it's not authoritarian, if whatever opposition there is in a country maybe sees the pressure as being illegitimate, that is to say, sees the sanctions as an explicit attempt to influence policy, they may resent that. Nationalists obviously are not really gung ho about other countries messing around in their country's politics. So it could be that sanctions end up generating more blowback, that they end up creating solidarity in the target between the opposition and the government you're targeting, such that the sanctions don't really do much. So, obviously, Cuba, for example, is an authoritarian country. So the sanctions there kind of impact the working class people and whatever middle class there is there, but obviously don't really do much to undermine the government's authority because they do have a pretty strong security apparatus there that can kind of handle significant dissidents. Iran, in contrast, is kind of between those two examples. It has the authoritarian regime in place that can suppress dissent, but it also has more legitimacy than an explicitly authoritarian regime like Cuba or Saudi Arabia, for example, an absolute monarchy. Obviously, Iran is not a democracy. It's not a free country per se, but they do have democratic institutions in place that do technically allow voting. Again, obviously the voting is not free and fair, and the candidates are vetted by I think it's called the Guardian Council, where they don't pick and choose who runs, but of the people who decide to run, they'll choose who can be blocked. They'll block some that they don't think should be allowed to run for election, and the result is that the field of choices that you can vote for in a given election in Iran is winnowed down to people who are not a substantive threat to the status quo.
It sounds like what
So
China does to me.
not not really, because in China they don't really allow elections substantively. You can find example. Well, I mean, technically there are quote unquote elections, but in a lot of the times it's like one candidate running for the party. There's actually more democratic elections in China than I think people might think. Um, as an authoritarian one-party state, elections are not really their thing. But at the local level, there actually are some localities that have experimented with it and kind of do allow it. They don't allow, obviously, systematic opposition parties to form, but they do allow individuals who want to run against a party candidate to run. And so long as that individual is not like an ideological opponent of the Communist Party, they'll generally let that slide. I remember back in the day, this was way back in, I guess, the late aughts, I want to say. Maybe chat can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think it was a village in southern China called Wukon, and the local party guy who was in charge of the village got very unpopular. I don't remember exactly what the context was, but I think it had something to do with a corrupt land deal. That's pretty common in localities in China, at least at that time anyway. So there was a guy, a local village elder, I think, who decided to run against him. And there was some shenanigans involved, but basically in the long run, he ended up becoming the new head of the village. He was able to win the election against the Communist Party candidate. There ended up being an attempt by the party to kind of pressure him into standing down after there were some protests in the village over some other communist policies. Uh, I think they ended up surrounding the town at one point, but I think eventually they smoothed everything out. But that's an example of some scope for democracy being allowed at the local level in some places, not everywhere, but some places. So they do kind of allow that. So it happens more than you might think. But it's definitely doesn't happen at a systematic level, and at the national level, I don't think it happens at all. China actually does technically have other political parties besides the Communist Party of China, but they're not true opposition parties. You know, they're loyal to the Communist Party, and they don't really represent uh, constituencies, or they don't compete with the party for votes or any of that. I think technically they specifically represent certain interests, like farmers, for example. I think one of them is supposed to be like a farmers' party or something. They're actually legacy parties. Back during the Chinese Civil War, there were a few political parties that allied with the Communist Party of China, and so the party ended up allowing those other parties to continue even after they won the Civil War, but their scope for independent operation was basically nil. So they're kind of showpiece parties at this point. They don't really fulfill anything more than a symbolic role at the national level. So that's all a long-winded way of saying that China doesn't have any kinds of substantive free elections at the national level. Iran doesn't have substantive free elections either, but it does technically allow competing candidates to run. So long as you're not explicitly anti Ayatollah or anti Islamic Republic, etc., they'll generally, depending on the candidates in question, allow people to compete for power. And while, again, they're not completely competitive, there has been competition. You know, again, there is a, well, to kind of illustrate what kind of competition happens in Iran politically, uh, there is basically, if I'm, I should stop saying basically, if I remember correctly, there are roughly three major political factions in Iran. One of them is the, I guess, what you could call the institutional interests. These are the guys, the actual clerics, the Ayatollah himself, you know, sort of the Islamic aspect of the Islamic Republic. Those actors kind of form a distinctive interest group of their own. I think those are the guys that kind of run the charities by which they generate most of their wealth. There's a lot of charities in Iran that collect a lot of money, but most of it kind of gets funneled into the clerisy and is kind of their source of funding that they use for patronage and to maintain their power within the Machiavellian maneuvering that goes on within the inner sanctum of Iranian politics. So there's those guys. And then there's also the nationalists. They're very conservative as well, but they're not as Islamist as the Ayatollah and the clericy. The nationalists are sort of more about Iran in general, and Islam is part of Iran's nationalist identity, but Islam is not the only part of Iranian identity. Whereas with the clerics, obviously Islam is more, you know, they're night and day. That's pretty much where it begins and ends for them as far as ideology and governance. The nationalists don't clash much with the clerics, but there has been tension. You know, some of you may remember. Well, I'll ask you, Neuro. Do you remember the president of Iran back in the aughts? It was a guy named, I think it was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
The name sounds familiar. I don't.
Yeah, he was in the news a bit because he would always come to the UN and release statements about how, you know, he was going to, I think the famous one was he said that he wanted to erase Israel from the map. And so that was construed as a desire to, you know, attack Israel and destroy it in some kind of apocalyptic conflict. So that was the big one that kind of made the rounds in the international media. But he was always making, you know, grandiose comments like that of one sort, or maybe not to that degree and not always regarding Israel, but he had a big mouth, basically. He was that kind of politician. And it didn't always sit well with the clerics. You know, the clerics wanted more of an emphasis on, well, obviously, for one, Islam, but Ahmadinejad also had more interest in an adventurous foreign policy, and allegations of corruption, I think, also were made that the clerics weren't entirely pleased with. I think the main institutional actor that represents the interests of the nationalists is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has close relations with the Ayatollah, but as an institution, it does have somewhat of a separate set of interests and perspectives. And generally, they work together, whatever their differences, because they have a common foe, which is the third major interest group, that being the reformists. Now, obviously, there are some liberal Democrats in Iran, some socialists, westernized people of one sort or another. But not all reformists are like that. There are actually conservative reformists, and generally, conservative reformists are the ones who are allowed to run in the elections. So the famous example there is the current president, whose name I think escapes me. I want to say Rafsanjani, something to that effect. I don't quite remember his name. Uh, but he is technically a reformer, albeit of the reformers, he's definitely on the right wing of that spectrum. But he was allowed to run against a nationalist, even more conservative candidate, and the public ultimately did vote for that reformist candidate. And that sent a signal to the Ayatollah and the establishment that the people wanted some kind of easing of economic pressure, wanted a more conciliatory foreign policy, etc. And so the Iranian government kind of recognized that, and in recognition of it, eventually negotiated, accepted anyway, the nuclear deal with the Obama administration. I think that was the timeline anyway. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that. But that illustrates that there is some competition there. It's within a narrow scope, but the government does recognize that it needs to allow people to vent to some degree. They can't vote for radical change, but they can signal what kinds of policies they would prefer. And when they're not really gung ho about traditional nationalism or Islamism or what have you, and some of the things that the nationalists and Islamists are doing in government, they can vote for the reformists that are allowed to run and kind of voice that dissatisfaction, even if they can't vote for people who are as reformist as they might like. There was actually a stronger reformist government, I think, in the 1990s. The government then had a lot more scope. I don't remember his name at all, but the president at that time was actually one of the guys who had been part of the Islamic Revolution back in 1979. He was one of the founders of the Islamic Republic, so his voice carried a lot of weight. He wasn't like some outsider who had not been an Islamist, who was kind of arguing or agitating for westernization or liberalization of one kind or another. He was an Islamist, but he wanted the government to take a softer line in its foreign relations. He wanted more reconciliation with the United States. He wanted the government to have a lighter hand. He wasn't going to get rid of the Islamic police, the morality police, whatever they're called over there. But he did want them to kind of take it easy, not be quite so heavy-handed in how they dealt with people. So that was kind of a relatively liberal period for Iran, if I'm remembering correctly. And eventually, later on, after 9/11 and the whole axis of evil thing, I don't know how many people are listening old enough to remember that, but some of you I'm sure do. That was the Bush administration came out after 9/11 and argued that there was an axis of evil that was supporting terrorism in the world, and the United States was going to make it its business to pressure them into reform, or failing that, perhaps explicitly overthrow them. And I think the three nations that were on the list were North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, if memory serves. So the Iranian government kind of took that as a bad sign, understandably so. And the government became more hawkish as a result. There was a willingness to work with the United States after 9/11, but the U.S. government wasn't really having it. They didn't trust the Iranian government, and there was a lot of hawks in the U.S. government that kind of saw 9/11 and the aftermath as an opportunity to expand U.S. influence and to remove, or at least challenge, some regimes in the Middle East and obviously on the Korean Peninsula that were adjutants, to say the least, in U.S. foreign policy. And that's kind of a whole debate in and of itself, why that happened and etc. But challenging Iran like that empowered a lot of hawks. And that was when they started flirting with restarting their nuclear program. And that pretty much marked, I guess, what is now almost 20-year deterioration in relations between the U.S. and Iran. But in the 1990s, before 9/11, the relations were not quite normal, but a lot better than they are now. They were at least more or less stable. The Saudis didn't much like it, but the U.S. was pretty much fine with it, and things kind of carried on business as usual in the Middle East during the 1990s without too much. Well, I shouldn't say business as usual because that's pretty violent in the Middle East, but things were relatively quiet in the Middle East in the 1990s, in part on account of that sort of de facto U.S.-Iranian détente. Anyway, all of that is just meant to illustrate that reformists are allowed sufficient scope in Iranian politics to compete with hardliners, nationalists, Islamists, etc. So that's my way of trying to elaborate this point I'm trying to make about how the Iranian government has relatively more legitimacy than other authoritarian governments because it does institutionalize, well, I should say, because it does utilize some democratic institutions. They're not fully democratic, but some of those electoral institutions they use do have some democratic facets. And that serves to give people, if not an outright voice in governance, then at least a stronger illusion that they have a voice in governance. And that has a beneficial effect on the government's legitimacy. It also helps the Iranian government that a lot of people in Iran really don't trust the United States. That kind of goes back to the removal of the Shah back in the 1950s. A lot of people, probably the vast majority of people in Iran, explicitly blame the United States for the removal of, not the removal of the Shah, I'm sorry, that's empowering the Shah. There was a conflict between the Shah of Iran. The Shah is like the emperor. He was sort of the traditional emperor, or sultan, maybe would be the more accurate term. There was competition between the Shah at the time, I think his name was Shah Pahlavi, and the elected president, whom was a guy named Massoud. I don't quite remember what his name was, actually, but he was a nationalist. He had been voted in not that long before, I think maybe 5 to 10 years before the coup happened. And his big thing was nationalizing Western-owned oil interests in Iran. And he obviously met with a lot of resistance from the British in particular, because British Petroleum owned most of the oil assets in Iran. So when this nationalist president started nationalizing those assets, there was a British embargo, I think it was, of Iran. And so that turned into a big shit show for everybody involved. The British were not really at the height of their power in the 1950s. The empire was still very powerful and relevant in international affairs, but an exercise in power like that at that stage was not popular. Imperialism was very much on the way out, so it was not a good look for them. But then for the nationalist president, I'm sorry, let me just look it up, because I'm sure I could Google it quickly. British. Somebody in chat's probably already posted it. Mossadegh, that's what it was. Mohammad Mossadegh. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. So for Mohammad Mossadegh, it was a big problem for him too, because as the British embargo went on, he actually lost popularity. It's true that the CIA helped fund and paid for some protests against him, but there was actually a lot of legitimate discontent in Iran against Mossadegh because of the embargo. He was perceived to be mismanaging the whole problem. He was thought to have been too aggressive and that he should have taken a softer line. He really did move very quickly to nationalize British Petroleum assets, and there wasn't a lot of negotiation. So he kind of forced a serious confrontation there where maybe he didn't have to. So he did get significant support, but he also had fairly significant legitimate opposition beyond just what was funded by the CIA. And I think it's also kind of worth mentioning here, and this is a little counterintuitive given later history, but removing Mosaddegh and empowering the Shah was actually supported by clerics in Iran. That is to say, the people that would later take over Iran and form the Islamic Republic, the de facto theocracy that Iran has now. They blamed the United States for overthrowing the government in the 50s, blamed the CIA for intervening in the nation's affairs, blamed the US for supporting the Shah and his intelligence services. The intelligence services under the Shah were famous for being brutal and intolerant of dissent and torturing people, etc. So that's kind of one of their that's kind of one of their calling cards, is to blame the US for that, and that's part of how they derive their legitimacy. But actually at the time, the Islamic clerics were kind of behind the overthrow of Mossadegh because they didn't like his secular style. He was a relatively secular nationalist, and they didn't like some of the plans that he had for modernization. That would actually be a theme, because that's also one of the reasons that the clerics turned on the Shah eventually. The Shah was all about economic modernization, and a lot of the clerics didn't much like that for obvious reasons. Economic development tends to bring social change, and that's not really what you're about if you're a conservative Islamic cleric in a mid 20th century Iran. So they were actually behind that, from what I read. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. Anyway, I guess that's kind of a tangent. But the point is that Mossadegh was getting more and more unpopular, and he wasn't really handling it well. Another one of the things that he did, and this is something that unnerved the United States, is that he started centralizing more and more power in his government. The Shah was already kind of all on the way out. The position of the Shah in Iranian politics was already kind of being marginalized. It had been on the way out for some time. The Iranian government under previous Shahs had tried to modernize the country by introducing a parliament, modern bureaucracy, etc. And there had been some competition between the Shah and the elected government before, but it wasn't until now that the Shah's power was kind of clearly in the eclipse. It was clear that the new government that had been formed was kind of coming of age and was becoming the preeminent institution in Iran, or at least in Iranian politics. So as that happened, as Mossadegh lost support because of that perceived mismanaging, and as the Shah kind of sat on his hands because he didn't think he could do anything, Mossadegh centralized more and more power to try to deal with the dissent that was emerging, which was not really the most democratic way to go about it, and that was part of the reason the United States kind of suspected he was an authoritarian in the making. But he also started inviting in communists. He started making nominal alliances with communists. The Communist Party in Iran was one of the supporters and defenders of the Mossadegh government, which was not unusual. Communist parties around that world at that time generally made alliances with nationalists. That's basically what happened in Vietnam. We should do Vietnam sometime. That would be fun. Anyway, but yeah, the communists were definitely involved in his government, and that kind of was maybe it wasn't quite the straw that broke the camel's back for the United States, but that was a big red flag, because at that time it was kind of, well, not kind of, but it was implicitly assumed among many in the United States government early in the Cold War that communist parties around the world were actually just puppets of the Soviet Union. And that's not really entirely true. Well, that is to say, it wasn't entirely true that all communist parties were just at the beck and call of Moscow, but it was true that the Soviet Union did have a history of trying to coordinate with foreign communist parties. That was what what was it called? Interpol? No, not Interpol. That's the police agency. It slips my mind, but the Soviet Union did build an institution in, I think, in the 1920s that was dedicated to organizing different communist parties around the world in the name of global revolution. I think they ended up scrapping it in like the early 1930s. That kind of reflected the debate between Trotsky and Stalin about whether it was better to propagate world revolution or to focus on building socialism at home. And Stalin pretty clearly won that debate. It's hard to win it when you're getting an ice pick in your brain. So as a result, the Stalin approach of focusing on the Soviet Union won the day, and there wasn't as much of an effort after that to kind of coordinate, but they still did it. Soviet intelligence kind of was out there in general, kind of building networks and using it for espionage purposes. So it wasn't completely paranoia that the Soviet Union was coordinating with them, but it was a little bit overblown, and there probably was a fair amount of overselling on the part of zealous politicians trying to push anti-communist policies. To be fair, though, there was a lot of Communist Party leaders around the world who were very did not. They gave a lot of reason to suspect that they were loyal to Moscow more than to their own countries. I remember when I was doing research for the Rio Treaty thing I've been working on. Uh, there was one guy, I think he was the head of of Brazil's Communist Party in the 1940s. I think he came out at one point after World War II, like just after, and said that he said this explicitly, that he was loyal to the Soviet Union and its government, and that he wanted Brazil's Communist Party to be part of the Soviet Union's plans to spread communism. Um, it was not the most deft political move, suffice to say. In a country as anti-communist as Brazil was, it was perhaps not uh, a clever way to go about signaling your position in Brazilian politics. So statements like that, not only by that guy, but other people, and just the general sentiment among a lot of people in communist parties around the world, kind of fed paranoia amongst anti-communists that they really were agents of the Soviet Union. So yeah, in that sense, communist parties around the world really weren't doing themselves any favors by stoking that paranoia. So those are that's a long-winded way of saying that there was some communist party presence in Mossadeg's government, and that's part of what got the U.S. involved. And to kind of bring that full circle, the reason he did that is because he needed to try to build alliances in order to maintain his popular support, which was kind of fading over the course of this dispute with Britain, and because of the embargo and its economic effects, which a lot of people in Iran were getting pretty tired of. I think people in Iran still supported nationalization. That wasn't the problem. It was more just the ham-fisted way that the Mossad government kind of went about it was more what was upsetting people. And also the fact that he was cracking down on protests and was centralizing power beyond the ambit of the Constitution. Those also were underlying factors. So all of that, of course, resulted in the UK and the United States trying to push the Shah to take power, which he didn't want to do. So they had to do quite a bit of cajoling to try to get him to do that. There was a number of people in the Iranian government, I think the military and some of the civil service, that were very much for overthrowing Mossad, and they tried to coordinate with the United States and the Shah, but the Shah was just so timid at that time that it took a lot of caressing and convincing, like, yes, we'll support you, it won't be a problem, blah, blah, blah. And finally, he eventually agreed, and they were able to move things forward and put the Shah in power as the central leader and the primary institution in Iranian politics again. So that's how the Shah came to power, basically, after the coup in the 1950s. I want to say it was in 54, but I'm not sure. But right around there in the 1950s there. And that's how that happened, and that's how the Iranian government today is able to kind of blame the United States for intervening in Iranian affairs, because that is sort of the principal example of that. Uh, Subsequent, decades, the U.S. support for, I think it was called Savak, actually. That was the Shah's intelligence service. The Savak was very unpopular in Iran, and U.S. support for that kind of also is seen as another one of the major adjutants for Iranian nationalists as far as the reasons why they dislike the U.S. and U.S. interference in Iranian affairs, as well as Middle Eastern affairs in general. So that's a source of their legitimacy. One of the sources of their legitimacy. A lot of Iranian nationalists are very suspicious of the United States. And in turn, to bring this full circle again, that's why, or part of why, sanctions against Iran are probably not as effective, because there is relatively more solidarity in Iran in response to sanctions because they're coming from the United States, which is a country that a lot of people there are kind of wary of for historical reasons.
Right. Sanctions, they do have an economic impact, but it also seems like a lot of it is, as you said, the political effort to make an impact. And if we've already pegged ourselves, speaking from an American perspective, as enemies, then, I mean, it's not really surprising if your enemy is pushing sanctions on you. Like, that wouldn't really rustle you in a way that causes you to reevaluate your situation. So, another point that you did in the comparison between China and Iran, and also just general elections, is the amount of democratic voice that the people have can vary quite a bit. And a lot of that depends on how freely they can choose the candidates. From what you said, it sounded like the process of elections in China is more of like charades rather than actual elections, where they have a lot of the trimmings of what an election process is like, but because it's so constricted on people who are already pro-communist party, then it's not really that much of an election at all, as you said.
Mhm. Yeah, it's I guess what you would call a sham election to a degree,
Mm.
but they do have them technically. It's just it's not entirely a sham election because at the local level they do allow some of that, like I said. But yeah, at the national level, uh, it's pretty much just who the party wants. It's not like a real legit election. Whereas in Iran, they do have them. They do have political competition that occurs to a degree that you would not see in China at a national level.
The pursuit of fairness is an ongoing process. Some elections are more fair than others. Some countries have a greater breadth of ideas than others. We have plenty of our own problems in the US too. Well, speaking of elections, we have the other big piece of news and talking point that some people have asked me about this past week, the British elections. So Boris wins again.
He does at that.
Thoughts, implications on that? I know a lot of the people in the StarCraft community and in the streaming scene are upset by this. Obviously, some people are happy about this, given that he won. Was this surprising to you at all, this outcome?
Yeah, a little bit. I was kind of expecting a hung parliament because I didn't really think that there was a significant edge that any one party had over another. You know, it kind of felt like political sentiments were still pretty split. So I was thinking it would be more like the last election, where there was where things were pretty indecisive afterwards. But as was, he was able, that is to say, the Tories were able to pick up a significant number of seats. So it was a huge win for them. It was actually, I think, the worst defeat for the Labour Party since 1983. I think that's what I was reading. So it was very ugly for them. That's it was a pretty bad night. So let's see. I think I did have some notes here, so I can kind of briefly go over them. Tories now have a clear majority, so they're going to be able to kind of do what they want as far as things like Brexit. Well, Brexit's the main one. That's what's on everybody's mind. So Boris Johnson, I think, said that he was going to have Britain leave the European Union at the end of January, I think it was. So that's probably going to happen. There will finally technically be Brexit at the end of January. The UK will officially leave the European Union, and that stage of the process will end. As we've discussed before, that's not actually the end of Brexit. There's going to be several more years of negotiations to go, but technically, the UK will be out of the European Union at that point. And there had been some question about whether or not there would be the votes in Parliament to do that, whether or not there would be some reversal, another vote. You know, there was just a lot of questions. But now with the Conservatives with a clear majority, it looks like Brexit will move forward as planned, and that focus will now shift towards the negotiation of what will probably be some kind of free trade agreement between the UK and the European Union. So that's kind of where eyes are at this point. Uh, you know, like I said, Labor did badly. Liberal Democrats kind of treaded water. They lost a seat. Uh, I think it was the leader of the party's seat, so kind of an important one. So not a great night for them either. The SNP did really well. That's the Scottish Nationalist Party. They picked up 14 seats. Tories and Labour both lost about 7 and 6 respectively in Scotland. So that's raising some questions about what's going to happen as far as Scottish independence. They obviously had a few years ago a referendum on whether or not Scotland should leave the UK and become an independent country, and it lost by, I think, 10 percentage points. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that. Uh, After that, the issue was kind of considered settled, but the problem became Brexit, because one of the promises made, well, one of the desires that was stated on the part of pretty much all sides in Scotland is that they wanted Scotland to stay in the European Union. And part of the conservative counter argument against Scotland leaving the UK was that if Scotland left the UK, then they would not automatically be in the European Union. And if they wanted to stay in the European Union, they should stay in the UK. And then the UK voted to leave the European Union, so that argument is obviously no longer in effect. So the argument by Scottish nationalists then is that the basis for, one of the principal arguments against Scotland becoming independent has been rendered void, and hence there should be another referendum to see whether Scotland should be independent, to see if minds have changed, basically, on account of the major changes in British national policy since the last Scottish nationalist independence referendum. So that could be a thing. But the Conservatives have said that they're dead set against it. The Tories said that the Scottish independence vote was a once in a generation vote or something to that in effect. So they're very opposed to it. But the Scottish Nationalist Party is just as steadfast that they should have it. So we could see a little bit of Catalan on the Thams over in the UK in the near future, so to speak. We'll see what happens with that. Probably won't be a big issue in the near term. I think most people will still be focusing on Brexit, and even if there is another referendum, it'll take months to negotiate all the details and stuff. So probably not too big a problem in the short term.
I think minor correction pronunciation is the Thames.
Is it the Thames?
The river you're talking about. They go with the French pronunciation, I believe.
Ah.
Yeah.
Well, there's another one I've been mispronouncing my whole life.
Yep. Well, it makes me feel moderately useful for something in these discussions. I get to be the pronunciation guide.
Don't shortchange yourself.
Yeah. Well, for a lot of these situations, I don't know shit about it. There was one thing that I ended up picking up while I was in an Uber. They just had the radio on, and there's a bunch of issues in India, it sounded like. People are very upset. Right-wing populism, it seems like, has a big surge globally speaking. And they're dealing with some of that in a way that is unfavorable to some people. I think a lot of it has to do with identity politics, Hindu versus not, whether India is a secular country and what kind of freedoms are given to different religious groups. India is very multicultural. I think that's one of the things that's difficult to perceive the further you are away from a given country, is how diverse it really is. India has a super large population and many different kinds of people in the country, lots of different religious groups and things like that. So for all of them to feel like they have a voice and they're free to express themselves is pretty difficult. Was there anything that had caught your awareness recently regarding India, or is it kind of?
Yeah, there was the big thing going on in India right now is this citizenship. Well, I guess it's not a citizenship bill. Technically, right now it's a refugee bill. It's about whether or not refugees from Bangladesh will be given official status in India and allowed to stay. And that sounds all well and good, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that, because it actually does tie into a previous citizenship bill, which was all about trying to verify the citizenship of people in, I think, I said Bangladesh, I should have said West Bengal, uh, refu- refugees from Bangladesh coming to West Bengal. And the citizenship bill before was, I think, principally targeted at West Bengal, as well as Assam and the Seven Sisters provinces up in the northeast there. The idea was that they wanted to try to, what's the word, deport illegal immigrants from Bangladesh. And the thinking was that the border was poorly enforced, and that there had been over the previous few decades a significant buildup of illegal migrants coming in, or I should say migrants from Bangladesh coming in illegally across the border and settling in West Bengal and basically the states surrounding Bangladesh. And that was a problem, obviously, because immigration is a sensitive subject pretty much everywhere, almost regardless of context. So obviously, there's economic pressures. People argue that they're undercutting wages by coming in. They complain about perceived cultural changes. Obviously, Bangladesh is a Muslim country, and most of the surrounding provinces are Hindu or Christian or perhaps another animist. Some of the native animist faiths, I think, are still prominent in some of the northeastern areas. So having a significant number of Muslims come in, that unnerved some of the locals as well. And obviously, like you say, it's kind of a nationalist period in India's history, and nationalism in India is increasingly defined by Hinduism. And not only Hinduism, but Hinduism almost explicitly in opposition to Islam in particular. So the issue of illegal immigrants coming in is sensitive enough by itself, but the fact that the immigrants in question are mostly Muslim just makes it all the more of a problem for nationalists in India. So it's actually true that a number of people had come in from Bangladesh over the previous few decades, but it really hadn't been a problem because a lot of the relevant laws regarding who's a citizen and who's not were not really enforced. And in fact, you can go even further. A lot of the people who live in West Bengal and who are not migrants from Bangladesh, even they don't really have a lot of documentation that kind of proves that they're actually there legitimately. So it's just one of those, it's an example of a law or maybe a policy that's just not really enforced. And so people don't take it seriously. And as a result, nothing happens. It's if you pass a law, then you have to enforce it in order to get people to observe it. If you don't enforce it, then it doesn't matter if you can go to jail for it if you don't expect to ever actually go to jail. So as a result, a lot of the relevant laws about documentation, whether you're a refugee or not, were just not observed. And that's partly just because administrative capacity in India is kind of poor. They don't have a lot of resources to put into it. There's corruption. Everything takes forever. It can take years to move through a judicial process or to get a paperwork of any kind from administration. So it was just kind of easier for a lot of people just to ignore it. And everybody was pretty okay with that for a long time until now. And part of the problem, again, immigration was a sensitive subject. So the government tried to take action by basically demanding that people prove that they were actually citizens. And again, the target explicitly was West Bengal in particular, as well as the northeastern states. And the idea was that they could significantly curtail the number of migrants who were there allegedly illegally. Now, that probably would have worked. It wasn't, they weren't wrong that there was a lot of people there who shouldn't have technically been there. But the problem that they encountered is that a lot of the people that were there were either there legitimately and had been, but just didn't happen to have paperwork, or were there legitimately, but were Hindu, which means that they were more likely to support the BJP, which is the nationalist party in India. And a lot of those people were upset that they were being targeted in particular. They thought that was a bit I don't know, hypocritical, like, well, not hypocritical per se, but they thought it was wrong that they were being lumped in with sectarian rivals. So as a result, eventually the government kind of moved away from that policy. They didn't end it completely, but they did stop it for a while. And this new effort regarding the refugees is basically the attempt to revive it and implement it like they kind of wanted to all along. And the idea with the refugee bill is that if you are a refugee from Bangladesh, then you can apply for official status, basically permanent residency in India, and be here legally. You will be free and clear. But the caveat is that this offer does not extend to refugees who are Muslims. It's only good for Hindus, Buddhists, Christians, what have you. So this is a problem because a lot of the people in West Bengal who are Muslims or whoever, a lot of them don't have documentation, but are there legitimately, and even those who haven't been there legitimately have been there for, you know, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. They have families, they have property. So really, they're in effect Indian citizens. Like having not enforced the rule for so long, it's pretty hypocritical. Not I'm misusing the word again. It's unfair, shall we say, to just jump in now and start enforcing it. And the suspicion is that it's a malicious policy at this point. But when it was just the citizenship bill, you could say it's just about immigration. But now it seems pretty clear that the way these bills are going to be used is that if you're Hindu or Christian or whatever non-Muslim religion you are in West Bengal or the northeastern states, then you can apply to be a refugee and they'll just give it to you. They don't even really care. But if you're Muslim, then whether you're an illegal immigrant who came in just the past year, or if you're an illegal immigrant who's been there for 30 years and is an established member of the community, or even if you're a legal resident, a legal citizen, but you don't have documentation to prove it, and you're Muslim, those people can, and it looks like will be deported to Bangladesh as illegal immigrants. And so this has led to a big hue and cry because the purpose of this policy, if that is how they're going to implement it, is to basically purge West Bengal of Muslims, which is going to be a problem for millions of people in West Bengal because about half the population is Muslim. Now, obviously, probably most of those people do have documentation and will be able to prove they're there legally, but there's a significant number who won't. And the government is basically just looking for an excuse to get rid of those people in particular. Now, the reasons why are debatable. Obviously, critics of the government say that it's borderline fascism, that they're being authoritarians, that they're just trying to oppress a marginalized community that is not in favor with the government. That could be true, but it could also be true that they're just doing it for the votes, basically, that it's just pandering to the Hindutva vote in West Bengal, that is to say the Hindu nationalist vote, and that they're just doing it for raw popularity, basically. It could also be that they're trying to build up their electoral advantage. They're trying to, obviously, if you're a Muslim minority in India, you're a little wary of the BJP, for obvious reasons. So that being the case, it kind of makes sense if you're the BJP to, if you can, minimize the number of Muslims who are available to vote against you. And obviously, this policy, if it is implemented as I described it, would significantly curtail the number of Muslim voters in West Bengal. And that would be to the advantage of the BJP, since those people are probably mostly supporters of either the Indian National Congress or some other rival party to the BJP. So this could just be abuse of power in that case. So there's a couple different possibilities. I'm not sufficiently familiar with Indian politics to really make a strong argument to any one of them, but those are the ones that come to mind. So it's still early days. It's just happened. There's been protests in New Delhi and West Bengal and etc. So we'll see what kind of comes of it. What they actually do. If they do implement the policy at all, and if they do implement it, how they implement it. So maybe it is going to just be a purge of Islam from West Bengal, or maybe it's more of a moderate purging of significant numbers of people without documentation, but is otherwise not necessarily discriminatory, although it is pretty much designed to be that way. Or on the other hand, maybe they just kind of completely half-ass it and they go back to just passing laws but not really enforcing them. That could happen too. So we'll see. But that's the big news that's been coming out of India.
There's a question in the chat: is West Bengal a state within India?
Yeah, yeah, it is. It actually used to be part of Bangladesh, or maybe vice versa. The whole thing was all just British India at one point. Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, all of that used to be just British India. It was all one territory. Uh, it was cut up into a bunch of different princely states and provinces and presidencies, what have you. But it was nominally one polity. And when the British decided that, well, there was a big question about what Indian independence would look like. How do you grant this huge territory independence? Do you just carve it up into different countries and grant them independence on a country by country basis? Do you divide up British India according to religion? Do you divide it up according to caste? Do you divide North and South, the Dravidian South versus the Aryan North? There's a lot of different ways you could have cut up British India to make different polities, and it wasn't really clear what the correct answer was. And so the British kind of deferred that decision for the most part to the Indian politicians and interest group. The main interest group was obviously the independence movement. So they kind of, the degree to which Britain interfered in the process is kind of a subject to debate, so I won't get into that. But what happened was there was a big conversation within India about how to break up or whether to break up British India. And Indian nationalists ultimately were able to negotiate among themselves. Obviously, there's an immense amount of diversity even among Indian nationalists at that time. So they negotiated amongst themselves, and it was agreed various concessions that would ameliorate concerns and facilitate a united India. But the one group that could never be reconciled to the idea of a united India was the Muslims, specifically the Muslim. I'm saying it wrong again, aren't I? Is it Muslim?
That works. That's the American way.
Okay.
Muslim or Muslim, which is the way that they say it.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to stick with Muslim for now. Muslim, yeah, the one group that couldn't be reconciled was the Muslims in South Asia, and their main party at that time was the Muslim League, as led by a guy named Jinnah. And they had a vision for an independent Muslim India separate from the rest of India. And the reasons why they were able to generate enough support amongst Muslim Indians kind of vary. There's kind of a whole history there. They never actually, I think, got the support of most Pashtuns. I think most ethnic Pashtuns and what became northwestern Pakistan were actually more for a united India. And then other Muslims were kind of on the fence. But events over the course of the late 1930s kind of concerned a lot of Muslims in South Asia, such that they were a little skeptical that Muslims in a united India would be treated fairly by what would be a Hindu majority India. And so there was a pretty strong desire to get significant concessions as far as Muslim representation in Indian government. They wanted reserved seats. That was a pretty common approach to trying to reconcile different groups within India. Dalits, for example, the untouchables, the lowest caste of the castes in India and the worst treated. That was a significant interest group in and of itself. And they were de facto led by a guy named Ambedkar, I think it was. And he was super skeptical about how Dalits would be treated in a Hindu India, and in an independent India, I should say. And he demanded reserved seats for Dalits in India, in a proposed independent India's future parliament, in exchange for his support, and in turn the support of the Dalit community in South Asia. And that was granted. And I think they still have those reserved seats today. Maybe I should explain reserved seats. Basically the way a parliament works is that if you're using a representative system anyway, everybody votes, and then seats are distributed according to the percentage of the vote that each party gets. With reserved seats, what you'll do is that you'll have seats specifically for specific communities. So it doesn't matter well, what matters is how those specific communities vote. And so how those seats that are reserved are distributed depends entirely on how specific communities or constituencies vote. In other words, those seats are distributed separately from the main seats that are based on the national vote. That's a rough, probably bad description, but I think you get the idea roughly. Uh, so that was a system designed to ameliorate minority groups like the Dalits, and the Muslims wanted a system like that. Uh, but a lot of people in the independence movement were skeptical because the Muslims were asking for for a significant number of reserved seats. In effect, they wanted a power of veto over the Indian government, and a lot of people thought that was unfair. And another problem was Hindutva, Hindu nationalists. That was a part of the Indian independence movement. It was not the only part, and it wasn't even necessarily the most important part, but they were present, and they became more active over the course of the 1930s, and some of the rhetoric coming from them unnerved a lot of Muslims in India. I think another problem, well, not a problem per se, but one of the things that happened I think it was the 1940 election, the British allowed some free elections leading up, 15, 20 years leading up to independence. And I think in the 1940 election, the Muslim League just got crushed. They did not win a significant number of seats, and it was a very ugly loss for them. And they responded to that in part by focusing much more on the idea of an independent Muslim state. So in a sense, you could argue that the Muslim League was that Pakistan is the result of an election strategy. The idea that they're going to try to win back the votes that they lost by pushing for a kind of, well, I should say, pandering to Muslim nationalism in South Asia. That was sort of a strategy that they took. But I don't think that's really I think that's part of the reason that the idea of an independent Pakistan, that's what the independent Muslim nation ended up being. That's how Pakistan was formed. That's part of the reason Pakistan ultimately ended up getting formed, but it's not the only port. That's not the only aspect there. Because again, even after 1940, when the Muslim League started pushing for Pakistan, they were still nominally arguing for reserved seats within an independent India. So that was left open as a possibility, the idea of a united India that included Muslims. It was only later when those negotiations broke down that Pakistan kind of became inevitable. And then, of course, some people in India just blamed the British. It's their fault that Pakistan exists. They wanted to try to have they wanted to try to retain some influence in South Asia, and so they carved out a independent Muslim India that they could have as a kind of proxy ally in South Asia.
So
I don't know.
historically, to get a sense of the landscape, both Pakistan and Bangladesh used to be part of India, but they're independent countries now, and they're both predominantly Muslim.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was. Yeah, that's the short version. I kind of got off on a tangent. I'm sorry.
No, I mean that's the aspect of hosting is I'm trying to follow everything and be able to give a compact summary of like the basic landscape there, because I think a lot of people don't know that as a historical thing. I think I actually learned that from you a few years ago.
What was that?
Oh, just that Bangladesh and Pakistan used to be a part of India.
Oh, yeah.
India has
yeah.
a very long history. From the American perspective, I think we're not used to having that depth of past because a lot of us are from different countries, Europe, Africa, etc.
Yeah, the past sucks. America's more about the future.
Yeah.
Now, why build a museum when you can have a parking lot?
Oh, man, we still don't have enough parking though.
Too true. But yeah, that Bangladesh was oh, that's the point I was getting at. Yeah, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh were all one state. So when there was a big debate about how to carve up India, blah blah blah, all the stuff I said. So that leads up to carving Pakistan out of British India. But then how do you do that? I mean, you can say that, okay, Muslim majority regions go into Pakistan and then everybody else is in India. But the trouble is that there was a lot of communities in British India that had mixed populations. That would be like, 60% Muslim, 40% Hindu, or, like 50-50 even. It was not like easy. It was not explicitly clear just how to draw a border between India and a prospective Pakistan. And so ultimately, one of the part of the ultimate part of the ultimate solution was expected to be the maintenance of open borders. So it was kind of assumed that India and Pakistan would be separate countries, but that they would retain strong economic and political and cultural ties, and that there would be open borders, and that everything would be lovey-dovey. They'll get along fine. They just have to recognize each other's borders and just maintain stability. Obviously, that definitely did not end up happening. For a whole other set of that's a whole other conversation. But that was kind of part of the assumed solution to that problem of drawing up borders. Now, as far as how they actually ended up deciding the borders, they actually brought in a lawyer from Britain who hadn't ever been to India before, and they asked him to do it. Like, here, you can do this, I'm sure, correct? Yeah, you're from Oxford, you can do anything. So just drop a new border between these two territories that have never been separate. And he said, okay. So he looked at the ethnographic maps and looked at the different communities and said, all right, some of these are obviously going to be one or the other. 90% Muslim. Okay, let's stick that in Pakistan. But one of the conditions that he had was that he wanted the territories to be contiguous. So, he didn't want like a territory that's 60% Hindu that's surrounded by, 70, 80% Muslim communities to just be an island of India, a little Indian enclave within Pakistan. So those examples generally were incorporated into, in that specific example, he would have incorporated that into Pakistan. And in the case of 50-50 or 60% communities that were kind of on the border between India and what would become Pakistan, that was kind of more of a judgment call on his part. And part of that had to do with historical factors. They wanted, what's it called? Amritsar. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that too. That's a city in Punjab, and that's a holy city in the Sikh religion. So there was a lot of mixed communities around that, but it was decided that that should be part of India because India was going to be more Hindu and Sikh, etc. So even though there was a lot of Muslim communities around Amritsar, they kind of went out of their way to try to put that in India. So that's just an example of the kind of arbitrary nature of some of the border drawing there. And that also illustrates how badly Punjab was affected. Punjab was very mixed. It had a lot of Hindus, a lot of Muslims, and a significant population of Sikhs. It was really a single contiguous polity and economic region, and it really should just be one territory. But it ended up getting split along sectarian lines, somewhat arbitrarily. And the result, of course, is the famous migration of Muslims out of eastern Punjab and the migration of Hindus out of western Punjab into India. I think they have a name for that. I don't quite remember what it was. But a partition, that was what it was. Partition, the partitioning of British India into India and Pakistan. That was very traumatic because a lot of people were very upset at the way the borders were drawn because they didn't want to be in a given, maybe you're Hindu and you don't want to be in Pakistan because you think you'll be mistreated and that your rights won't be respected. Or maybe you're a Muslim who lives in a village that ended up in India and you're afraid that your rights will be violated. So there was a massive migration of people out of the two territories after the borders were released. And there was a huge amount of violence that resulted from that. I think probably more than 1 million people died, thereabouts. It's a rough estimate, I think. But, after escaping World War II relatively unscathed, India actually did go through some serious trauma afterwards as a result of partition. So it's not as though India got out of the 1940s unscathed. Anyway, Punjab was really badly hit by that because that was like ground zero for some of the most difficult decisions. It wasn't as hard in other places because other places didn't have as many people. Like one of the defining geographic characteristics of the border between India and Pakistan is, I think it's called the Thar Desert. I'm probably misremembering that, but there's a big desert between them, and not a lot of people live there. So that's not like a big deal where the border is drawn there because there's not a lot of people to get upset about it, and that makes up a good chunk of the western border of India and its border with Pakistan. So not too much of a problem there. But Punjab was heavily settled, it was heavily populated. It was economically developed, relatively speaking. So that was much more disruptive to draw a border right through the middle of that, basically. So partition really badly hit Punjab in particular, but then the other province or state, as it were, that was badly hit was Bangladesh, or as it was called then, Bengal. And Bengal was pretty mixed. I think it was mostly Muslim at that point, but it was pretty relatively evenly divided between Muslims and Hindus. And I don't think it was as developed as Punjab, but it definitely had a lot of history with the British. It was the first place that the British East India Company had colonized slash conquered, settled, however you want to frame that. And as a result, the Bengalis were some of the first people in India to kind of really be systematically educated with Western education and be exposed to Western ideas. I had a Bengali friend in grad school, and he told me that within Indian society, the sort of stereotype of Bengalis is that they're the intellectuals, and that kind of reflects their history as being exposed to Western education and getting involved in things like Western literature. They were some of the first Indians to publish Western style literature, intellectual works of one sort. I think there's a famous Indian writer named Tagore. I don't quite remember his name, but he's very well known in India and in the literary world, even outside India. And I believe he was Bengali rather, if memory serves. But that's what I was told anyway. The stereotype of Bengalis was that they had kind of been exposed early on to Western ideas, culture, technology, etc. And as a result, they ended up sort of developing faster than the rest of India in the early 1800s, and ended up being kind of the ideas guys of Indian culture as a result. I don't know how true that is today. I think other parts of India have since leapfrogged Bengal in terms of development, but back in the day, that was the case anyway, and the stereotype is apparently stuck. But anyway, Bengal at that time was relatively developed. It was an intellectual center. It was a cultural center. It wasn't the capital of British India anymore. The capital of British India had been in Calcutta, which is the biggest city in Bengal. Um, it had since been moved to New Delhi, I think around like 1905 or 1910 or something. But Calcutta was still a very important city. So all told, Bengal was like Punjab, was a single polity, a single economic entity. It was not it was not really meant to be divided, but because they wanted to do a sectarian division, they had to. So it ended up being very disruptive in Bengal, just like it was in Punjab, and there was millions of people who migrated from one side of the border to the other, and there was a lot of violence. So that's just to illustrate there that Bengal was very badly affected by partition, and that's kind of part of its history. But to bring this full circle, very long-winded, long circles today. Um, this is how West Bengal, the state, was formed. So to kind of address that question about is West Bengal a state? Yeah. Originally there was one Bengal, but then because of partition, it was split into West Bengal, which became a state in India, and what became East Pakistan, sort of the eastern section of Pakistan, and a polity that later became the independent nation of Bangladesh. So Bangladesh and West Bengal are basically the successor states to what had been a united Bengal.
Cool. There's a really nice comment in the chat. uh, when you're saying that they consider themselves to be the intellectuals, you said that's what all communities say, that they're the intellectuals. That's an aspect of in-group, out-group that you learn about in psychology, is you tend to see a lot more of the good qualities, the nuance, the diversity within a group that you're familiar with and a part of, as opposed to the groups outside of that.
Mm.
This applies to a lot of different things, and this is one of them. Oh yeah, we're the smart ones. They're the lazy ones who don't really think about stuff very much. They're less capable, less gifted, blah blah blah. Across the board, this is very
Mm,
common.
yeah. Yeah, in group, out group is a uh, very common facet of human nature. Sometimes for better, oftentimes for worse, but that definitely plays a role in how people view others,
Yeah,
like you say.
it's in my opinion, I think definitely for the worst from an objective, logical perspective, but we're not evolved to be objective and logical all the time. Some of it
Mm.
is just energy saving. It's cheaper on your brain to make a bunch of assumptions because then you don't have to think about the perfect answer to every problem. That would be way too daunting, especially when there's a bear chasing you down right now.
Yeah, yeah, that's certainly the case. Sort of cognitive heuristics, if you like.
There's a bear chasing you and you're just stuck trying to figure out the right balance of proteins, fats, and carbs. Are eggs good for you or bad for you? And there's like, hmm.
Yeah, efficiency definitely has its benefits.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, not many bears around these days, so not quite as much pressure to be efficient.
Yeah, I think there's still healthy bear populations in certain regions. They're pretty good at avoiding people, though, so we don't really have problems with the bears. They like being
Suits
left
me.
well enough alone.
I don't think I could run very far. Well, let's see. I think that, well, to get back to the UK, because I still had a little more on that. So I talked about sort of the election results. Labour did terrible, Tories did really well, everybody else, meh. Scottish Nationalist Party did well, so questions about independence. Indie Ref 2 is what they're calling it on Twitter. Twitter always has catchy names for things. So, what's sort of the general takeaway here from the British election? Um, One of the things that I kind of perceived there is that the Labour Party's coalition between the working class and urban professionals seems to be falling apart. Like it's really not holding together very well at all at this point. And the Tories, for their part, the Conservative Party, they seem to be slowly becoming the party of the working class, which is weird given British history. But I was reading the other day, and I think I posted it on Twitter too, on my Twitter account. There was a story about a journalist who has experience with British politics, and he was talking about this one community, which had always been just reliably Labour. They always voted for the Labour Party through thick and thin, and that in this recent election they had flipped to the Conservatives. And it was a thoroughly working class neighborhood, just very prototypically Labor territory. But they voted conservative, and it just kind of blew his mind. He kind of couldn't believe it, that this, and it just signifies the substantive nature of this change that's happening. And I think that just comes down to political realignment. We're sort of in this era of significant economic churn that's sort of upsetting traditional notions of how to make a living, traditional livelihoods, and it's creating waves politically and socially that are playing out. And political realignment seems to be one of the manifestations there. It really seems like the working class in particular doesn't seem to have as much faith in labor parties or center left parties in general, since we see this very similar phenomena playing out across most of the developed world and even in some of the developing world. Whether or not that sticks or not, I don't know. That's kind of an open question. But for now, there seems to be some skepticism of the center left. I think there's been some recovery over the past few years. I remember like 5, 10 years ago, people were talking about, well, 5 years ago, more like, I remember reading about, the so-called collapse of the center left and, what the implications would be. And there were some dire predictions, but center left seems to be hanging on to a degree. Scandinavia seems to be doing pretty well. They seem to have kind of recovered their ground a bit, but in other places it's a little more shaky. But in Britain, there really seems to be, for now, a shift away. I don't know how again, to reiterate, I don't know how substantive or long term that'll be, and that kind of gets into some of the other stuff here that I have. So one of the problems that get into some of the takeaways here. One of the statistics that I read, labor lost votes in historically labor voting constituencies. Again, that kind of speaks to that realignment, especially in areas that voted leave in 2016. That's not going to surprise anybody. But what I thought was interesting, labor also lost votes in constituencies that voted remain, which is counterintuitive. If this election was kind of a vote on Brexit, you would think the remain voting counties would, constituencies rather, would vote for labor. And for the most part, they did, but they actually lost votes in those areas relative to the previous election. And the reasons for that are debatable. It could just be that people just didn't like Jeremy Corbyn. If you're not familiar with British politics, Jeremy Corbyn is the head of the Labour Party, and he's kind of a controversial choice. He's kind of a controversial politician, I should say. The previous head of the Labour Party was a guy named, I forget his first name, but his last name was, I think, Milligan. And he was actually, his twin brother, I think, was also a politician. Somebody from the UK would know this better than I would, but I think both of the twins were involved in Labour politics, and I think were rivals at one point. But anyway, the head of the Labour Party had been Milligan. He was very much a centrist leftist, and he was just not very charismatic. He just did not have like the magic. He didn't have a lot of pull. He just couldn't inspire people. He didn't have like great ideas. I don't know that anybody really had great ideas in British politics back in, I guess it would have been 2012, the 2012 election. But the Conservatives had the benefit of not having been in power for a long time, so they were kind of the opposition choice, the choice for change, I guess. So Milligan's inability to really energize labor and to kind of come up with some new ideas to energize the voting electorate kind of doomed labor, and have resulted in almost 10 some years of conservative governance. It's not 10 years yet, but it's getting there. And after that, there was a big debate within the Labour Party about who should lead the party, and that debate reflected a broader debate about what the party's central ideas should be. What is the Labour Party about? What are they pushing for? What is their soul? What is the soul of the Labour Party? More technically, what's their policy platform going to be? And obviously, the centrists all said, we can't alienate people in the center. We can't alienate people on the right. We should try to build a big tent coalition. Blah blah blah. But that's basically what they'd been trying to do, and there wasn't a lot of support for that. People were not particularly excited for that. But there was this other guy named Jeremy Corbyn, along with a number of like-minded people, who really pushed hard left, old school socialist style policies. Not explicitly socialist, but very much on the left side of the spectrum of labor politics in the UK. And he ran hard on a pretty strong record of being an honest politician. And, he wasn't like, he was almost, I guess, what people in the US would call a British Bernie Sanders to a degree. Although I don't know how well the analogy holds up to inspection. But roughly, that's kind of what he is in British politics, to draw an analogy. So there was a lot of skepticism of Jeremy Corbyn and Corbyn's ideas within the Labour Party, but nobody else could build a significant amount of support. There was just no energy. There was no passion. Corbyn's ideas were the only ones that did generate passion. He had a pretty excited, loyal, cohort of followers within the Labour Party and the Labour voting electorate. So he was able to win the leadership contest. And a lot of people were pretty upset, but a lot of people were also really excited because the far left of the Labour Party really finally had the party. They were finally in a position to really push their ideas and compete for power on a national level instead of within the party. So, if you're from Britain and I'm getting this wrong, please correct me in chat. Maybe I should give the usual disclaimer. I'm definitely not an expert in everything I talk about. I have a stronger background in some areas than others, economics, foreign policy more. So if I say anything wrong, stupid, biased, whatever, please contribute in chat. I want to learn more than anybody. And I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it after. So, I will see what you write eventually. And one of the things I really get out of this is getting feedback from people and getting information from people. And so, please do contribute that. Everybody else kind of learns from that as well. So it's just generally helpful. Participation is encouraged, so to speak. So That said, if I'm getting this wrong, please correct me, British listeners, if you're out there, or, anybody who's maybe more familiar with the topic than me. This is what I'm remembering from what I've read in the news. So this is not like expert opinion here. I'm not going to print it. I'm not going to pretend it is. But this is just sharing my understanding of the issue. So that's my understanding of how Jeremy Corbyn came to head the Labour Party. And so the big question then after that is whether or not Corbyn could really compete at a national level. And in the last election, which was 2017, I guess, um, Labor did okay. They didn't really do great, but it was okay. And there was a sense that maybe if they just really pushed those left ideals, those leftist idealist policies that Corbyn was known for, then they could excite the electorate and really kind of make it in the 2019 election that they just had. And it seems that that just catastrophically failed. To be fair to Corbyn, it's not necessarily just that a lot of people didn't like his ideas, or maybe even just him himself. There was a bunch of controversies about anti-Semitism and terrorism. I suspect some of those were trumped up, but uh, those were there as factors anyway. But I don't think it was just that people disliked him. Another factor is that I think Corbyn, or at least the general leadership of the Labour Party, kind of tried to please everybody on Brexit. There was a lot of people in the Labour Party who voted for Brexit. It's not as though Labour was the Remain party and the Tories were the Leave party. Both parties actually have pretty significant constituents and voters who voted for one or the other side. They're not monolithic in that regard. And Corbyn kind of tried to please everybody by trying to stake a middle ground. He wasn't explicitly fighting for Remain, but he didn't really come out explicitly for Leave either. And I think he wanted to really focus more on, economic policy and economic reforms, et cetera, sort of these big tent ideas, and the belief that those were kind of the big vote winners. But as it happened, it seems that hasn't been the case. And it could be that the vote against Labor was not so much a vote against the ideas themselves per se, but more maybe against the politics, that style of politics. It may be that we've moved as part of this general shift in the general political realignment, that style of politics that focuses on economic policy is not as relevant as, say, a nationalist issue like immigration or Brexit or what have you. It may be that that's more the crux of politics going forward, and that by eschewing it, uh, the Corbynites and Labor and whatnot were not able to really maximize their benefit in terms of who they were appealing to amongst the voting electorate. Conservatives pretty hard came out as the Brexit party. Boris Johnson and his people in the Tories, among the Tories, were pretty clearly for not a hard Brexit per se, but they wanted to quote unquote get Brexit done. I think that was one of their slogans. So it was pretty clear that if you wanted to vote for a Brexit, explicitly for Leave, explicitly for getting the UK out of the European Union, then voting for the Tories was the way to vote, since the Labour Party was kind of wishy-washy on just what they stood for on that. So those are some opinions on the subject. This is not like some professional analysis, but I'm trying to kind of tie it into some stuff we've talked about before, which is political realignment and structural economic change, etc. People who are working class voters who have kind of been left behind by a lot of the technological and free trade evolutions that we've seen over the past few decades. They don't clearly have a place in sort of the new world that's emerging, and they're kind of struggling, and policymakers are struggling to kind of figure out what to do about it. As we've discussed before, I think over the long term, it's a problem that solves itself, because if you're a young person growing up, currently, then you can kind of see where the jobs are, and you can kind of you can structure your education accordingly to try to maximize your competitiveness in that job market. I think a lot of the discontent now comes from people who have older skill sets, but are older themselves and don't have a lot of time or resources to invest in updating their skills. or maybe don't have the information to know what skills to invest in. So for them, all of this tumult, all of this structural economic change really puts them at a disadvantage because it's creating a lot of dynamism for people who are not necessarily that flexible, who are not necessarily sufficiently flexible to really deal with it and sort of bend with the times. So, in so much as that's accurate, and there's some evidence for that as far as, if you look at the distribution of voters according to age, Leave voters are way disproportionately older, and Remain voters in the UK were disproportionately younger. So maybe in the long term, it's just young voters eventually inherit the country and that they're not as upset by all of the changes that are happening in the economy because they're not really put out by them. Ideally, there would be some policy you could implement that ameliorates all of the concerns amongst those people in the working class now who are struggling because of the changes, and then things can kind of smooth out sooner, but there's not really a clear set of policies that would actually do that, hence the problems we have now. So if that theory is true, then a lot of this is going to be temporary, short to medium term, like 15, 20 years, and then things kind of maybe not go back to normal, but reach a new equilibrium that is a lot less rocky than the current politics that the developed world is experiencing right now. An optimistic reading, I know, but it's something anyway. There's a lot of different ways you can interpret that. Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent again.
Just a question from me. Why are older people more opposed to leave and younger for stay?
The older people are for leave, and the younger people are for remain.
Right. Is
So
that
the
just
reason for
older people tend to be more conservative, and that's the conservative choice?
yeah, that's part of it, but I think it also comes down to things like, well, part of it's probably industry. A lot of the working class places that used to vote labor are working class neighborhoods that specialized in, factories of one sort or another, and a lot of those have left. Of those that have stayed, there's been a lot of people coming in from Europe who are immigrants, like Eastern Europe or other places, and they've been kind of filling up a lot of those working class communities and creating some tension with some of the older folks there who kind of see the community changing. So dislike of immigration and the changes thereof, and a sense that free trade is not benefiting them by, sort of removing their traditional working class jobs. I think that makes a lot of them very skeptical about internationalism of any kind, be it in the form of immigration or free trade deals or what have you. So there's a sense that globalism, as I think a lot of them would put it, is a net negative for the British economy and for them in particular. And so for those people, they kind of want to move away from that for that reason. For others, it is strictly about immigration. For others, it's maximizing British sovereignty. There's always been a pretty decent sized chunk of the Conservative Party in the UK that never liked the UK joining the European Union and has been whining about it incessantly for the past, 30, 40 years, however long it's been. And, winning that referendum was sort of their day in the sun. That was like a minor miracle for them. And they're certainly enjoying themselves right now. But they've always been there. That cohort never went away. But a lot of those guys are a little bit older too. They tend to be of the older school of thought that wants to maximize British sovereignty because they see Britain as being sort of a special country that has a special role in the world and that they can better fulfill that role if they're not tied down by all these surly continentals, as they would call them. The continentals are sort of do things differently than they want. Generally older folks and especially older conservatives want less regulation, a more open, dynamic economy, etc. And there's a feeling amongst them that being in the European Union requires them to adjust British regulations to be too tight. They want to kind of open things up, and getting out of the European Union gives them an excuse to do that. So for the older folks in that sort of sovereignty crowd, it's something that they've just always been for. So those are a couple different reasons. I think younger folks generally, kind of like what I was arguing earlier, and maybe you could cite this as supporting evidence. Younger people generally are not as tied to those old economy type jobs, the factories, the working class jobs, etc. Generally, they get into the services economy of once, get fighting for, working in a services industry of one sort or another. So for them, it's not really a net loss to lose those kinds of jobs or to have immigrants take them. They've kind of moved into other areas in order to benefit. And also, I think younger people kind of see more benefit to the European Union in terms of freedom of travel, freedom of travel slash freedom of movement, the ease of access to continental education systems, agreements on, benefits, how you can live in other countries in the European Union. All that stuff is more beneficial, you could argue, to younger people who move around more and are more invested in the new economy, such as it is, than older folks who are still kind of invested in the old economy and are feeling the pressure as their communities kind of dwindle and due to the lack of economic competitiveness and economically competitive industries.
Yeah, that makes
So
sense.
that's
Older people tend to be more rooted as well with stuff like home ownership and the like,
mhm.
where they kind of find out where they're going to settle and they're really focused on what their community is like. Younger people have more of that, well, I have no idea what I want, who I am, or where I'm going, so whatever.
Mhm.
And then millennials and Zoomers and stuff, like, we're per capita owning homes a lot less, moving around more, and I think our mindset is more of a global mindset. A lot of people, I think, many times aren't considering themselves of a particular country. We're internet kids now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of a digital cosmopolitanism that ties people together in a new way that hasn't really been possible before. So yeah, I think you're right. That probably does create more appeal for international institutions and international integration. So those are some factors there that could explain some of that political realignment. That's also why I was saying earlier that it might be temporary, because it could be that once the older voters kind of age out, so to speak, and the younger voters kind of move in and fill that space, then it may be that the opposition to further integration kind of dwindles with time as a result. So that's conjecture. It's not really clear. Long-term predictions are hard and unreliable, to put it mildly. But that could be the case. On the other hand, it could be a permanent realignment, in which case we could see the Labour and Conservative parties in Britain sort of reorient their political platforms to reflect an emphasis on integration, the degree to which countries integrate with each other and the degree to which there's an integrated market in which labor and capital moves freely. Seen some of that now, but it's still not quite there as a fully explicit uh, demarcation between parties, and the political coalitions that comprise the different parties certainly don't reflect that yet. I think both parties are kind of trying to hold on to the old coalitions to a degree, and they're not really being very successful in that. So I think over time they're going to start trying to search for new coalitions, and eventually we'll see more clear-cut voting constituencies and policy platforms that will demarcate them.
There was a question that's semi-related to this discussion. Scotland holds another independence referendum. What is the likelihood that Northern Ireland would follow?
An independence referendum?
Yes.
No chance. Northern Ireland is not interested in independence, as far as I know. The big debate in Northern Ireland is more about whether or not Northern Ireland should integrate into the Republic of Ireland. So I don't think there's any chance of an independence vote. The major constituencies in Northern Ireland are the Irish and the Protestants. And the Protestants want to stay a part of the UK. That's why they're called unionists. They're for maintaining the union with the rest of the UK. And the Irish, in turn, are generally more Irish nationalist and want to see Northern Ireland united with the Republic of Ireland in order to create a united Ireland in which the Irish nation is rendered whole again, as they might say. So I don't think independence is in the cards, but I do remember reading, and I thought this was pretty interesting, that part of the peace agreement, I think it was the Good Friday Agreement, by which the time of troubles was ended. That is to say, the violence between the Protestants and Irish in Northern Ireland. Part of that agreement is apparently that if there is a substantive demographic change or a substantive shift in political opinion, that there can be a referendum in Northern Ireland on whether to join Ireland. And apparently the demographics of Northern Ireland are changing such that the Irish are making up a larger and larger proportion of the population. So we could actually see a referendum there. I hope I'm remembering this correctly, but I think this is how it was going to work. I think there is a good chance that there will be a referendum there in around 2020 or so. Well, that's next year, so maybe not so soon. A couple of years down the line, not too far down the line, in which Northern Ireland could very well vote to join Ireland, in which case you could see Northern Ireland break off from the UK. So that's a distinctive possibility from what I read. So, between that and Scotland potentially getting independence, it's looking like it could just be England and Wales, if that does actually pan out like that. For those of you who don't know this, and this is some random trivia, I guess, but some people might not be aware of this, there's a difference between the United Kingdom and Great Britain and England. All of these are sort of different territories. The United Kingdom refers to the entire country, and you can kind of see that because United Kingdom is actually short for United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So Great Britain then does not include Northern Ireland. Great Britain is just England, Scotland, and Wales. So that entire island of Britannia, or whatever you want to call that, that's its own thing. That's Great Britain, and then Northern Ireland is separate, hence the name United Kingdom. And then England is just one of the polities that comprise Great Britain. It's easily the largest in terms of geographic size and population, but it is technically just one of them, next to Wales and Scotland. So in the future, we may not have a United Kingdom, basically. If Northern Ireland does actually leave and join Ireland, they would have to change their name because it wouldn't be the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland anymore. It would just be Great Britain at that point. And if Scotland leaves, you could still call it Great Britain, but it would just be that England and then a little bit the little territory of Wales over there on the west. So that'll be something to watch for going forward. So let's see. I had a little more on the British election here. Turnout in Labour constituency. Well, sorry. Turnout in constituencies that voted Leave was slightly lower. So they may have been turned off by the choices available to them. It could be that they wanted to vote for a Leave candidate, but didn't feel that Labour was really sufficiently Leave to justify their vote. So let's see. All told, some Leavers, some Labour who voted for Leave in the Brexit election probably voted for the Conservatives, again reflecting that political realignment. But then also there was a surprising number of Labour voters who just didn't turn out to vote, or maybe who voted for Conservatives as what they perceived as the lesser of two evils, because perhaps they didn't like Corbyn and some of his proposed reforms. So all told, it seems to have been weak strategy by the Labour Party, and if you wanted to vote for a candidate or a party, more accurately, that represented your interest in Remain, you didn't really have a clear-cut candidate to really vote for. I guess Liberal Democrats were probably the party that was the most explicitly Remain, but they don't seem to have had they didn't seem to be able to generate a lot of support out of that position. So let's see, talked about the S&P. Oh, so something else to watch. Since the Conservative Party is basically now becoming a coalition between traditional conservatives in Britain, whom are sort of business elites and middle class type folks, there's a growing coalition between those conservatives and the conservative nationalist working class, and that's kind of an awkward coalition, since obviously their interests are somewhat divergent in terms of economic interests. And it's going to be very interesting to watch how that coalition shakes out in the medium term. It could work in the long term, but the coalition and the government is going to have to generate opportunities for working class folks in order to really kind of maintain their support. But it's kind of unclear now um, just how many labor intensive industries are even really left in Britain that really employ a lot of working class people. And more to the point, how labor intensive industries are really going to benefit from Brexit, which is pending. Um, it seems like that's going to be a headwind for a lot of industries. So I don't know that labor intensive industries are really going to benefit that much from it. But I could be wrong on that. We'll see. But that's going to be an open question. It could be, and this is something that we're kind of seeing in its beginning stages here in the US, it could be that the Conservative Party recognizes that they can't really do much to really improve conditions for the working class explicitly, either through subsidies or welfare or through free market reforms of one sort or another or free trade deals. And maybe instead that they just use patronage, that they give protectionist measures to industries that are labor intensive, or that they give explicit subsidies to such industries, or maybe they generate a lot of subsidies for communities that are struggling, something to that effect. Just basically some kind of sort of traditional patronage style politics where you're just sort of winning over their vote with de facto economic support. So that could be a possibility. And over in the United States, we kind of see this with some of the nominal protectionist measures that have been implemented, like for the steel industry and the aluminum industry. That's not explicit patronage per se, because it's couched in policy terms as a retaliation for dumping of steel and aluminum, which is legitimate to a degree, but it's also legitimate. It's also rationalized in terms of nationalism and protecting industries and propping up American-owned industries and workers, etc. And that kind of gets away more from the economic justification as being pure retaliation and moves more into the political realm of being a form of reward for political support. And obviously, there's a fine line between, you know, patronage, which is a kind of corruption, and legitimate interest, which argues that this is the best, this is the best policy for the country. It props up communities, middle class, et cetera, et cetera. That is a kind of a fine line there. And the reason I would paint it as patronage is because it does mark a pretty clear break with traditional policy. That's not a bad thing. It could work out in the long run, but at the moment, it seems like it could be a solution to that problem I was talking about before, about how to try to improve the conditions of working class folks who have seen their traditional livelihoods disrupted by free trade deals, technology, structural economic change in general, et cetera. How do you kind of deal with that problem policy-wise? And it could be that there's no real good traditional policy that you can use, and maybe the only thing you really can do is to just try to pander to them and sort of give them resources explicitly or implicitly in the form of some kind of what would have been considered in a previous era kind of patronage. So right now, that's in its early stages. It's not explicitly patronage right now, but it could grow into it in the future. That remains to be seen, but that's definitely something I'm kind of keeping an eye on. That would definitely be a pretty negative outcome in a lot of ways, but a potential benefit to that would be that it would ease political tensions and address that structural problem there. And so conservatives may do that in the UK just to try to maintain that somewhat unwieldy coalition that they're building. So a final note here. I know I'm droning on about this at this point. It's worth noting that the difference in voting share between parties that were pro-Leave and parties that were pro-Remain was much closer than the number of seats. Pro-Brexit parties, be they the Conservative Party or UKIP, only got about 46% of the vote. So not like a clear majority in terms of voting share. If you're wondering how it is that they got such a relatively low voting share but a relatively high number of seats, that has to do with the UK's electoral system, which is first past the post. And as a result of that, there's generally, like a lot of systems like that, some irregularities as far as the match between seat share in Parliament and voting share. I think in some cases, Labor's, well, I shouldn't say Labor, but the vote was split in a number of constituencies between different parties, and as a result, conservatives were able to win without a majority. So some constituencies were like that, but I don't know how many relative to the whole. Regardless, even though they only got 46% of the vote, they have a clear majority in parliament, and they're going to be able to move forward with Brexit, among other, sundry conservative reforms that I'm sure they'll try to pass. But the reason I point that out, though, beyond talking about Britain's electoral system, Johnson is not going to have like a really strong mandate as far as public support. Obviously, half the country like really loves Brexit. Other half very much does not do so. That's going to manifest in different ways in terms of potential unrest or etc. Just in terms of the votes in Parliament, he's obviously going to be able to do whatever he wants, pretty much. But he's not going to do it without some pushback if he pushes things too far. And there were some protests, I think, on election night from some anarchists or something. I saw that on Reddit, but it doesn't seem to have represented a broader protest against the government and the election's outcome. But I wouldn't be surprised if Johnson pushes his luck too hard. If he governs like he has more of the mandate than he actually has, as represented by the voting share, there actually could be protests, because I think that could be the straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of electoral reform, which is something that everybody in British politics has talked about at one point or another over the past couple decades, but nobody ever does anything about it because it's hard, and whenever they're in power, it generally doesn't benefit them. Generally it's the opposition, be it Labour or Tories, that talks about electoral reform, and then they get into power, and all of a sudden it's not a priority. So that could change if there's a significant protest movement in reaction to some strong arm move on the part of the Johnson administration. But I don't know if I don't know if that's going to happen. It may not even happen even if he does push his luck, but that would be something to kind of keep an eye on. Electoral reform isn't really something people get excited about, but in the right set of circumstances, it could be. And given how contentious politics is in Britain, among other places, that it's not too much of a stretch to think that electoral reform could end up being a significant driver of unrest of some kind, depending on context. So that could be interesting. So we'll see.
Awesome. This has been fun. It seems like we've been able to go deeper in a couple areas, primarily the region around India and then also Britain.
Yeah, sometimes my memory actually works. Sometimes it does better. Sometimes it does better than it does at other times. So
well, with this
seems to be.
particular scenario, oftentimes if you can focus on a tighter area, then you're going to be able to recall more memory, just because you're touching on more of those associations you have than if you're hitting a bunch of questions and your mind is kind of all over the place. It's harder to go deeper.
Yeah, I agree. Having focus definitely helps. So thank you for providing the stage for that. The framing. That's kind of makes things a little easier.
No problem.
So was there anything else that caught your eye, Neuro?
I think those were the big things that I noticed. The Britain elections, there were a bunch of people who were hyped. That always makes me happy when people are hyped about some of the more non-gaming content that I do. They were like, yo, what is Agent Smith's thoughts on the British election? It's like, I don't know, we skipped the session because my sleep was messed up, but we'll hit it next time.
Yeah, it was a pretty big election. It's there's going to be some significant changes. I would think that the Labour Party is going to think about changing leadership. Corbyn has already come out and said that he's not going to lead the party in the next election, so it seems like he's going to step down at some point. He hasn't really made it clear when, but it seems like he's pretty tacitly admitted that the party isn't going to move forward with him. So that would suggest a pretty significant setback for some of the people who support him, and the ideas that Corbyn represents. I don't think they'll go away completely. I think they're always going to be there in the Labour Party to some capacity. But I don't think it's going to be the driving force like it's been under Corbyn for the past couple of years. I don't know what they will do. This kind of resets Labour to where it was after it lost the elections back in 2012, when Cameron kind of came to power. They were kind of soul searching then for some kind of coherent policy platform that they could run on beyond just generic center leftist type stuff. And they tried Corbyn, and that doesn't seem to have worked. So what now? That's going to be a very interesting question to see going forward, because that's a very similar problem faced by a number of left or center left parties around the developed world. We'll see. Well, yeah, there's been stuff happening the past couple weeks. It's just, I don't think a lot of it is going to stick. Like the Iran protests, I don't think are going to be like long lasting. I just don't think there's enough challenge to the Iranian government right now in Iran in terms of challenges to its legitimacy and in terms of weakness in the government's ability to suppress dissent. They seem to be in pretty good position on those accounts. I could be wrong, I'm not an insider, so what do I know? But yeah, I'm a little skeptical. It'll go anywhere. I really don't think the economic strategy is going to work. I don't think it's a bad idea per se to put sanctions on Iran, but I don't think it's going to result in regime change or a revolution. I just don't see like the root factors kind of needed for that in Iran right now. The country definitely has liberals in it, especially in Tehran and the bigger cities, but I don't think that there's enough of them or that they're influential enough to really institute change by themselves if they did try to do like a revolt or a protest movement or something like that. There's still a lot of socially conservative people who in Iran who prefer or at least tolerate the Islamic Republic and that form of governance, and who maybe don't entirely trust liberals living in big cities. They've got that urban-rural divide just like anybody else. So I don't know that there's much that's really going to be able to come from that in the short term. I could see institutional reform driven from the inside. We've already seen some of that to a degree. But I don't know how substantive it can be. It could be, but I think there would have to be like a pretty significant shift in power between the right wing of the insiders, such as they are, the Ayatollah and the IRGC on the one side, and then a pretty significant shift over to the other side of the spectrum, amongst the reformists.
One sobering aspect of trying to make sense of all this as a person who browses news and follows different things is the people who do journalism and reporting and posting of articles, they're doing this as their job. So sometimes there's a story that's hyped up a little bit. Sometimes it's hyped up a whole bunch for the purpose of getting clicks and being able to make money and pay rent and things like that. So sometimes there will be situations that come up where it's presented in a way that, oh man, shit is hitting the fan now, like everything's going to change and be different. But if you really look at the details of it and you think about what is the statistical likelihood that a major change is going to happen as a result of this, sometimes it's super low, which can be kind of disappointing. But that's something to guard yourself against when you're consuming news and media, is you can't always take the reports at face value. Sometimes they're hyping it up, largely because that's the way that you get attention with articles and stuff in this clickbait era of information. As a content creator, I even try to do that with the way that my posts and things are titled, because you can have a more bland title that may be more accurate versus one that's kind of spicy. It catches the eye. It seems more dramatic than maybe the situation actually is, but that's how you get someone to click into your content. So this kind of thing happens a ton with world news. And that's the nice thing about having you on, is you have more of that larger perspective than many of us.
Well, I try to have one anyway. It can be hard to keep up.
No, the world's a big place with a lot of people who have a lot of things to say.
It sure does.
Well, cool. We're right at 2 hours, so I think between the 2 and 3 hour window is one of those we base it on your energy kind of things. I know it's 1:20 a.m. Texas time, 11:20 Pacific time.
Yeah, pretty early. Well, I guess there is one story I wanted to get to at least. Did we have any questions? I mean, beyond the ones that you already shared?
No, it's been more of a cozy evening. There was some feedback about Iran and the history there, which I think you can catch up with in the chat after. I didn't really know how to interpret it. Sometimes you'll say stuff and they'll be like, nah. And it's like, well, I don't know if it's worth interrupting you to pass along a nah because I don't
Well,
know.
I could easily be wrong. It certainly wouldn't be the first time. You know, a lot of that Iran stuff I got from a foreign affairs article I read, I think a year or two ago. So, you know, besides that being a long time, I may not have remembered it correctly. The article itself may have had inaccuracies. So there's plenty of room for me to be wrong on the subject. It's definitely not something I'm an expert in. You know, I really need to study Middle Eastern history in general more because I'm more familiar with the modern history, but I haven't really studied like medieval to early modern history as much. So that's kind of something I'm weak in. So yeah, that's I could easily have made some mistakes there. Feedback definitely appreciated, if so.
Yeah, I typed that in the chat instead of saying something aloud. If you've got a correction, he wants to hear it. Like you don't have to.
Yes.
You don't have
Yes,
to be
please.
mad at Agent Smith. He's not super married to any particular point that he's trying to make. It's about the pursuit of truth over time. So if you have a better truth than he does, then that's a win for him. He's not trying to beat you in a debate. Agent Smith versus Twitch chat. Live debate Sunday evenings.
On Twitch chat will probably win that most of the time.
I don't
Well,
know.
let's see.
It can
Well, there was
surprise
one.
you.
There was one story I did want to try to get to tonight. If we don't do any others, and I don't really know how to frame it because it's kind of a weird one. And this is actually I actually shared the article on Twitter. I think it was yesterday or the day before or something like that. So Neuro, how do you feel about lawyers?
Well, I think they're very competitive people, generally speaking. And the stereotype, I don't know a ton of lawyers, but the stereotype is they're pretty cutthroat and oftentimes are more focused on winning the case than making sure that justice is served correctly.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a very common impression among a lot of people, especially those critical of lawyers.
Yeah, but there's
So,
also the kind of lawyer that does a bunch of boring, tedious stuff, like
yeah. And
patent law and things like this, where you're getting really deep into some very boring and convoluted text.
mhm. Yeah, that's a fair point. That is probably the far more common type of lawyer. You know, I think a lot of jobs are like that. It's people have exciting perceptions, and then the reality is generally more mundane. So, yeah, I think lawyer probably falls into that category. But my follow-up question then, now that you've illustrated sort of the general impression of lawyers, uh, how do you think it would weigh on people's mind? Well, how do you think people would perceive uh, a horde of lawyers attacking a hospital?
What in the heck? Is this a movie? What?
No, this was an actual event this past week.
Like an army of lawyers with like sword and shield just going ham with a bunch of like legalese at them or something?
No, they used their fists. They uh, they attacked a hospital, destroyed equipment, you know, overturned things. It's the whole. They literally attacked the hospital.
They're just punching the building.
So the genesis of this, and this happened in Pakistan, by the way. The genesis of this, roughly from what I can remember, and maybe Chad can fill in some of the details. Uh, there was a lawyer who passed away. He was in the hospital, and so about half a dozen or so of his associates in the Lawyers Association, such as it is in Pakistan. About half a dozen of them came to pay respects at the hospital. And I don't remember the details. I don't even know if they shared them, but somehow there was a fist fight between those lawyers and some of the doctors at the hospital. So things escalated very quickly. Now, after that fight, both the lawyers and the doctors at the hospital both complained to their respective associations within Pakistan. And both of those associations, in turn, initiated litigation and started making demands of the other side, demanding apologies and restitution, demanding that the government get involved and arrest the people on the other side who they believed were responsible. It turned into a big debate. So the government got involved and there was a negotiation, and eventually there was an agreement made. And both sides were pacified. So one of the things that was going to happen is that some of the lawyers involved were going to go to the hospital and they would receive an apology. That was the plan. And then that would have been the end of it. But the trouble was one of the doctors that had been involved went on to social media and gloated that they had humiliated the lawyers in the fight. And that's when the shit started. After that, the Lawyers Association, I guess, mobilized, for lack of a better word, and they just ransacked this hospital where the incident had happened in retaliation for this perceived insult. And they went around and they busted machinery and, they knocked over, they did all kinds of shit. They fought with the doctors like it was a raid, in effect. They raided the hospital. And it wasn't like benign either. There was I think several people there in the hospital who needed attention who didn't get it and died as a result. So there's a big shitstorm in the Pakistani media right now about how terrible a light this casts on Pakistan, how it shows the weakness of the rule of law in Pakistan, how it reflects very poorly on Pakistani lawyers. It has not been a good look, suffice to say. It is not great PR for anybody involved. But it did happen. If you were in that hospital on that particular day, you would have been sitting there minding your business only for a horde of people in business suits to randomly run in and start wrecking shit.
Man, I'm having two visceral reactions to this. The adult in me is like, this is some of the stupidest shit I have ever heard in my entire life. And the kid in me is like, this is the most awesome shit I've ever heard in my whole life. When is the movie coming out? Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's pretty weird.
I want to see a montage now of the doctors getting trained, they all go on a retreat where they're all training MMA together to get ready to fight the lawyers. They line up for a medieval style battle. Let's go. Wow.
Yeah, that is a thing that happened. Now, lest you get a bad impression of Pakistani lawyers from this story, which I think many people will.
No, this improves my perception of lawyers.
Well, Pakistani lawyers actually have more significance than you might think in Pakistan. Because in Pakistan, the legal system, the judicial system, if you want to call that, is probably the most developed institution in Pakistan next to the military. It's relatively evolved, it's relatively professional, etc. As compared to, say, the political establishment, the administration, and administrative agencies, etc., stuff like that. And as a result, they've played a pretty important role in Pakistani history, especially in Pakistan's modern history. Generally, when there has been military government in Pakistan over the past 50, 60 years, which has been pretty frequent, lawyers have been at the forefront of the push to reintroduce democracy. And generally, they've been important leaders and an important part of Pakistani civil society in general that helps prop up what democratic culture they have. And that played a really important role more recently, I think around the year 2000, when General Musharraf was still in power. He was a military dictator. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name. But General Musharraf was in power, and He became increasingly unpopular over time because of, one, corruption, of course, but also because a lot of Pakistanis were upset with his authoritarian rule in general. They wanted to return to democracy. Musharraf had overthrown a democratically elected leader, Nawaz Sharif, I think his name was. He actually came back later. He's also very corrupt, but he was democratically elected, and Musharraf got rid of him, seized power. Tensions grew over time, especially in civil society. And it was actually the lawyers and the Lawyers Association in Pakistan that took the lead in starting mass protests against the Musharraf government that eventually resulted in him resigning and the reintroduction of democratic governance in Pakistan. So they are an important part of Pakistani civil society and important actors in Pakistani history, above and beyond their apparent feud with the Doctors Association in Pakistan.
Not only are the lawyers in Pakistan the experts at law, they're also one of the more viable and powerful street gangs, with an especially violent rivalry with the doctors.
You know?
Someone in the chat was saying that the engineers are going to come in and start fighting too.
You never know.
All the different white collar professions are just duking it out.
It would be an interesting battle to watch.
As Moss Neotech said, it's kind of like the Anchorman scene where the different news stations are getting different pitchforks and tridents and fighting each other.
Mm-hmm. So that's Pakistan. That was the big news out of there recently. It's maybe not the most important news in Pakistan, but it definitely caught my eye. So let's see. I think we've got time for some more. Did we want to do Lebanon? I had a whole bunch of notes on Lebanon about what's been going on there, but I don't know. Would you be interested in that?
Hell yeah. I don't know shit about it.
Okay.
That's the best. Where you just go in with a fresh perspective of zero knowledge.
Well, hopefully I don't add more confusion.
Well, it's hard to be confused when you don't have any information.
You'd be surprised.
It can be achieved if you work hard enough at it.
Can be achieved. I've certainly done that to myself plenty of times. Oh, before we get to that though, let me make a quick recommendation. There's an institution, I guess it's a think tank in Europe called the European Council of Foreign Relations, the ECFR. And recently, they've had a podcast for some time, just regular episodes, just sort of general foreign policy talk, nothing like too big or dramatic, just sort of generic discussion by academics for the most part. But recently they had a short, I think 4 or 5 episode series on 1989, which is not something I think I've really addressed, but it is the 30th anniversary of 1980. It's been 30 years since 1989. And 1989 obviously was a pretty big, 30 years? My math is off.
It's 30 years. That's my birth year.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, 30 years is right. That was obviously a seminal year in world history because, the Cold War ended, democratization, the opening of the world economy, a whole bunch of important stuff happened in 1989. It was a pretty significant year. So I hadn't really been paying much attention to it, but the ECFR podcast ran a couple episodes interviewing people from different countries about, the impact of 1989 and the events thereof on their country. So, they had a China researcher talk about, the impact on China. And they also don't just talk about 1989. They also talk about history since then, and how international relations and economic ties have evolved since then. So they had a China episode, they had a U.S. episode, a Russia episode. I think they also had a kind of an Eastern Europe episode. I think those are probably also a Western Europe episode, but I don't think I saw that one. And probably some more I missed, but those were the main ones that I've listened to so far, and they're pretty good. They're pretty informative, and it's just interesting history in general. So anybody who's interested in history and wants to learn more about 1989 and some of the history there, I would definitely give that. I would definitely recommend that short couple of episodes and over on the ECFR podcast site. So something for you history lovers to check out if so inclined.
Sweet.
You can also check out my podcast, but that's probably not going to be as engaging. I'm definitely still learning the art of production values and presentation. So if you've got a strong constitution, give my podcast a try. But definitely, if you're interested in history, give the CFR guys a try. I think they did a pretty good job with that.
Well, you have a very good manner of speaking. It's smooth and eloquent and all that. So I think certain like full-time content creators are really good at the pizzazz of production. And yeah, that's it can be an edge, but in my opinion, it's not the most important thing. A lot of people have said that this is the most relaxing political information they've ever heard in their entire life, which is its own distinct edge. And I think pizzazz can sometimes work against that. So the best approach for content creation, in my opinion, is to find out what your style is and then to refine and polish that style rather than to see another creator who's successful, but their approach doesn't really fit your approach. And if you try to emulate that, it would kind of seem forced rather than like the best version of what you do.
Yeah.
I talked about this a bunch with regards to comedy and creative improv and stuff. And Kukio was basically my sparring partner in terms of skit and comedy improv and jokes. A lot of times when you try to make jokes and be funny or do a funny voice, it's crap. It's just not funny. You don't really connect the dots that well. Maybe the voice that you do, the accent that you're trying to put on, it's like, it's not British, it's Australian-ish, but then you like do some Irish. But if you've practiced it for years and years and years and you've been bad for a long time, you get to be kind of decent. And then you end up being excellent, and then people see an excellent joke or a really convincing accent, like, man, you're just so gifted at this. And it's like, I wish you heard all the really bad jokes and all the half-assed accents that I was trying to do along the way. You would be maybe less amazed at the talent and more amazed at the dedication despite the poor execution along the way. So don't be discouraged.
Well, I'll keep at it. I think part of the problem is the writing. I think it sounds like I'm reading from a script, I think. And that's not really great. You know, I would like it to be a little more engaging. So try to more, at least sound more spontaneous, just so that it doesn't sound like you're listening to somebody read from the phone book, you know?
Mm.
That's kind of more the direction I would want to take it. And probably will, since I'm damn sure not going to do another 2-year research stint. You know, I'm going to definitely try for more regular postings, as you recommended. So I think, I think I'll still use scripts, but maybe not lean on them quite so hard like I am now. But anyway, Lebanon. So, I mean, you know what like Lebanon is, right? You know, just as a country and
Yep.
sort of roughly the rough contours. It's like, for maybe those of you who are not familiar with Lebanon, it's a small country in the Levant, in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's an Arab country. I think everybody there is ethnically Arab, but there's a lot of diversity in terms of religion. That's always kind of been the distinctive thing about Lebanon. It used to have a majority Christian population, but since then there's been a lot of demographic change, and now the Christians are, I think, a slight minority. And the other two big sectarian groups are Shia Islam, well, I should say Shia Muslims, and then the third group is a weird Muslim group called the Druze. There are other, I think there's some other groups too, but those are easily the three major ones. The Druze are kind of weird. They're kind of like Muslim Mormons, because the Druze as a sect were founded by a guy who just kind of came out and said that he was God, something to that effect. And he had enough people who kind of went along with it to form their own little thing over there. So now Now that's a sect. As you can imagine, a lot of conservative Muslims don't really consider the Druze to be an actual Muslim group, but the Druze themselves insist that they are, and well, they survived the Civil War anyway, so you can't really you can't count them out. You can't just ignore them. So they are a significant faction there in their own right. Lebanon used to be a major, well, it still is. Lebanon is a major tourist center. It was kind of known as the Paris of the East way back in the early mid 20th century because of all the places in the Middle East. The city of Beirut, the biggest city and capital of Lebanon, was sort of known for being a little more raunchy, a little more open, a little more liberal, etc. And what happened was the Civil War happened, starting in roughly the 1975, I think, mid-late 70s thereabouts, and that civil war was fought partly over demographic changes that was disrupting the balance of power between the Christians and Muslims in Lebanon. Uh, but also it had a little bit of a proxy war thrown into it. The Israelis were supporting the Christians, and the Syrians were supporting who were they supporting? They were supporting the Palestinians for one. That was why the Israelis got involved in the first place. But I think they were also supporting they were supporting the Shia Muslims as well, because I think they helped start Hezbollah, if I remember correctly, because Hezbollah started up as a resistance organization fighting against the Israeli military presence in southern Lebanon, if I remember correctly. So the Lebanese civil war turned into a giant shit show. A lot of people died, and Beirut was not really so much the Paris of the East for the duration. It was a little too violent and unpredictable, but eventually the war did end. I think in the late 80s, early 90s, thereabouts. And then a few years later, in like 1998 or so, the Israelis finally pulled out of Lebanon as well. Well, not so much the Syrians, but that came later. The Israelis pulled out in the late 90s. And then I think there was a big assassination of the president, a guy named Hariri, way back in like 2004, thereabouts. And the result of that was widespread disgust in Lebanon and mass protests against the Syrian government, which was suspected of having orchestrated the assassination, since Hariri was kind of a nominally pro-Western leader in Lebanon. So the result of that is that Syria kind of pulled out the troops and intelligence agents that it didn't allegedly have. Supposedly, they weren't there, but after that protest movement, they actually did pull them out, and that significantly mitigated Syrian influence in Lebanon. So at that point, the civil war had been over for a while, but at that point, the legacy had kind of finally started to wind down. The peace agreement that was signed itself basically just divided power in government between the two major factions. And so I think the way it works is it's something like the president is Christian and the prime minister is Shia, and the speaker of the house is supposed to be Druze, something like that. I don't remember the exact distribution, but it reflects the what the Iraqi government did after the U.S. invasion. I think we had a big long talk about that in our last session. So that's pretty much what they did. They had a sectarian distribution of power in the government that institutionalized sectarian differences, and kind of like with Iraq, that did not really have a great effect on the health of Lebanese democracy and political institutions, which kind of brings us up to today. It skips over a lot of stuff, but roughly that's where Lebanon is coming from. It's kind of was anyway, still recovering from civil war, was a little bit unstable politically. And I guess I should also point out that that rebel group Hezbollah that I mentioned is actually the most powerful military force in Lebanon. They're more powerful than the Lebanese army, easily. They've been getting a lot of support over the years from the Iranian government because they're the principal anti-Israeli force in Lebanon, if not also the Levant in general. So they're a super powerful militia. They've got long-range missiles, ballistic missiles, a huge arsenal of weapons. As far as militias go, Hezbollah is about as top-notch as you can get without being an actual army. So Hezbollah has a lot of political power in Lebanon as a result, correspondingly. So that's more or less, there was more or less a shaky equilibrium in Lebanon politically between the different factions, and over the past 30 years, Lebanon's been relatively peaceful, and it was able to return to being a significant tourist destination as a result. Of all the countries in the Middle East over the past couple decades, Lebanon has definitely been one of the less violent ones anyway. Obviously, there was the big 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel, but that wasn't as destructive as, say, Iraq, or certainly as the Syrian civil war has been. So that's a quick review. So that brings us to today. Uh, the Lebanese government and the major political leaders in Lebanon really lean on patronage as their principal political policy platform. That's the main way that they get and maintain the support of the people that they allegedly represent. Again, most of the parties are principally sectarian. There's a Christian party, a Muslim party, etc. There's some competition there. I think one of the big Christian parties is called Amal, and they're actually allied with Hezbollah. They've both been getting in trouble for, well, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. So the point is, though, that there's been a shaky equilibrium. People don't particularly like Hezbollah outside of the Shia Muslim community, but they maintain a lot of support because they offer a lot of services, a lot of social welfare programs. They kind of give out money, basically. And they get that from their power in government, as well as from aid from Iran and other sources. So patronage is the big thing in Lebanese politics. That's just how politics works. And the result is that public services in Lebanon are pretty garbage, because you don't put people in charge of Lebanese public services based on how competent they are. You put them in there based on whether or not they support you. That's part of what patronage is all about. You reward people who support you with money, with jobs, etc. Jobs in government are particularly valuable because they generally come with a lot of protections, a lot of job security, which people like. And so those are very popular, and politicians and political parties give those out willy-nilly as best they can. A really good case study of this, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I think this is a good example. A couple of years ago, there was a big disagreement over garbage collection. I don't remember exactly what the crux of it was, but basically the different political parties couldn't agree on how garbage collection would be done. And so they just stopped. Garbage collection in Beirut just ended because of this dispute. And it dragged on for months and months. And garbage was piling up, and it just got to be a real problem. It was a health hazard. So eventually, some people started to try to do it themselves. They actually organized basically community garbage collection to try to get around the parties and the dispute. And what happened is some of the parties and their people actually started attacking those people. Some of the party thugs basically would go after them. And the reason is that garbage collection was a source of revenue for the party. That was a source of patronage, and it was something that they wanted for their supporters. And to have communities do it themselves, even if it was for free, meant money out of the pockets of the patronage network and the people therein. So that was an explicit threat to the party and its revenues, and as a result, there was actual violence over garbage collection. So not only was there not garbage collection, you were actively being punished for trying to collect it yourself. I don't know that that was necessarily ubiquitous. I don't know that people all over Beirut were being chased down and hunted because they were trying to get rid of their garbage. But there was at least one case where that happened. I remember reading about it some years ago. So that really illustrates the depth of patronage politics in Lebanon. That really is an important source of revenue for the parties, an important source of legitimacy. And for a lot of people in Lebanon, which has a high unemployment rate, relatively speaking, especially amongst youth, those are pretty good jobs if you can get them. And if somebody's threatening to take them away, that's going to get a response out of you. People will respond very negatively to that. So that's a quick snapshot of patronage politics in Lebanon. So there's poor public services as a result. People don't like it. It's upsetting, et cetera, et cetera. So what do you do about it, though? The political parties are pretty entrenched. Reform is hard. And there's all that. There's some residual concern probably about a potential, return of conflict. The Civil War was, a couple decades ago, so it's not really that relevant to a modern political context. But There is always that threat that it could come back if tensions between the different factions and political coalitions were to be exacerbated uh, one way or the other, however it might happen. If we have anybody from Lebanon or somebody familiar with Lebanese politics, please do correct me on any of this that I might be getting wrong. I would certainly welcome criticism on any of this. Again, I'm not super well versed in Middle Eastern history, so this is just based off of my intermittent reading over the past 15 years. So I'll try to do my best here, but definitely please jump in and correct me if you have information. So let's see here. So okay, let's get to the meat of the matter here. What happened recently were allegations. I guess this would have been like a month or two ago, thereabouts. There were allegations of a shortage of banks. Sorry, there were allegations of a shortage of dollars at banks in Lebanon. Now, notice I don't say shortage of currency. I'm not saying that they didn't have like any money, specifically US dollars. There was an accusation made that banks in Lebanon of all sorts didn't have as many US dollars as they said they did. And that's a big deal because in Lebanon, like a lot of developing countries, US dollars are generally the currency you use in order to engage in international trade. And that's important, especially for a small country, because if you're a small country, you probably don't produce most of what you consume. You probably import a lot. So it's important to have access to US dollars in order to facilitate that. So when there were accusations that banks in Lebanon didn't have enough US dollars to facilitate that trade, that got to be a problem. Now, the central bank was not in question. Well, actually, it was part of the allegation, but it was solid. Its finances were actually good. But really, the commercial banks were the problem. Just the privately owned banks in Lebanon, and they had been squeezed for a while. They actually did have a shortage of U.S. dollars, and it was because of a range of negative economic factors in Lebanon. One, there had been a fall in remittances. If you don't know what a remittance is, that's where somebody in a country goes to another country to work and then sends some of the money they make there back to their old country. That's called a remittance, and it's a very important source of revenue for a lot of developing countries. So Lebanon, developing country, has a number of people that leave Lebanon to work overseas, sometimes in blue collar work, as maids or what have you, in some GCC states. Others go to Europe to work in white collar jobs, etc., when they can get them. So basically, long story short, lots of money is coming into Lebanon from remittances. It's propping up the economy, propping up banks. But as the global economy has slowed, uh, there's been a fall in remittances, and that's been hurting the financial health of these banks and reducing the number of US dollars available. Let's see. So there's also been sanctions on Hezbollah. Hezbollah, obviously, very important politically, but also a player internationally as far as Israel and the regional security situation. Uh, Unsurprisingly, the U.S. categorizes Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, and they've been putting more sanctions on as tensions with Iran has been heating up over the past few years. There's also been a fall in foreign aid. That had to do with the government failing to implement economic reforms that it had promised in order to get that aid. Basically, the aid was conditioned on economic reform. The economic reform was not delivered, so no aid, or at least a reduction in aid. And as that happened, there was, as a result, less US dollars coming into the financial system. Apparently, there's $11 billion in aid that's waiting for these reforms. So that's a pretty significant chunk of change that would help them. But because the government has been dragging its feet on the reforms that are conditioned, on the conditioned reforms rather, that hasn't been unlocked yet. So for these reasons, the financial sector is not in great health, and there's a particular shortage of US dollars. Now, regardless of the shortage, the expectation that there would be a shortage based on the allegation led to a spike in the black market exchange rate in Lebanon. That is to say, the official exchange rate, that is to say, the official exchange rate that the central bank was exchanging US dollars for the local currency at was different than the rate that you could get out on the street. In a lot of developing countries, there are money changers that just operate on the street or, in different areas, and you can just come up to them and exchange US dollars or whatever hard currency you have for local currency, or vice versa. And as it was, the local currency was becoming devalued, and the US dollar was becoming more valuable in relatively speaking, as a result of this fear that there was a shortage in the country. So this created an arbitrage opportunity for that reason, because there was a difference in the exchange rates, and that exacerbated things, because people could take their money out of the bank, that is to say, their money in the local currency. They could go to the central bank and exchange it for US dollars, and then they could take it to the black market and get a whole shit ton of local currency in exchange. You could also do vice versa. If you've got US dollars, you could, well, I guess you wouldn't do that, but basically you could exploit that difference in values, the official rate of the central bank and the fact that it was different than the black market rate, and make a decent profit. That's what arbitrage means. So as a result of that arbitrage opportunity, a lot of people started doing that, and that actually exacerbated the shortage of US dollars, because now more people are trying to exchange them, and that's putting more pressure on the local currency as well. So in order to staunch that, commercial banks had to implement withdrawal limits. They limited the amount of money you could withdraw at one time. Again, that stopped the outflow of money coming out of the banks and entering the black market. So the result of the withdrawal limit is that there was an actual shortage. Regardless of whether or not the shortage had been real in the first place, the expectation drove the arbitrage opportunity, worsened the difference in exchange rates, and then the commercial banks had to respond by creating withdrawal limits that actually did limit the number of US dollars in circulation, because people just couldn't get the money out of the bank anymore. As a side note here, this really illustrates the importance of expectations to economies. Expectations are a big deal. So, imagine, for example, if there actually was no shortage at all of US dollars in Lebanon's banks, which could have happened. The mere fact that expectations had changed in this way would have still meant the commercial banks would have had to implement withdrawal limits. It still would have meant the black market exchange rate was different. There would have been an arbitrage opportunity, and there would have been pressure on the banks correspondingly. So that's the power of expectations and the power of markets in turn. So that said, so the end result of all of this is that Lebanon's currency devalued, and US dollars became hard to find. And that was a big problem for importers, especially people who imported fuel and wheat. They needed dollars to import those goods. And in turn, because they needed US dollars to import them, they started demanding that their customers pay them in US dollars. They hadn't done that before they could take local currency from their customers and then just exchange it for US dollars and then import what they needed correspondingly. But with US dollars short, they couldn't do that. So they either stop importing completely or they start getting US dollars from the customers. Now, if you're a customer, that's a problem, because you probably don't have a lot of US dollars, and getting them is going to be expensive. So in response to this, bakeries and fuel stations actually went on strike, because they basically just couldn't carry out their business. If they could get any US dollars at all, it still would have been at a premium and they would have been paying more. So this is a big problem for people who sell fuel, which obviously everybody uses, if only to gas up their car, but also to fuel up electricity generators, among other things. Just a number of things use fuel, suffice to say. But also, wheat is an important food source that obviously gets turned into bread and whatnot. So that's a major foodstuff over there. That also puts pressure on people. So it's not only the people who make the bread and refine the fuel, it's everybody. So not only did these institutions go on strike, everybody is kind of on board with it because they see prices going up on account of the lack of US dollars and the lack of ability to continue importing the same amount of goods. So all told, significant currency devaluation, and the result is significant inflation. And that not only hit consumers and upset them, but it also hit government finances. It meant that the tax revenue that they were gathering did not go as far. That is to say, the real value of the government's tax revenue fell because of the inflation. And the government's finances were not exactly in great shape already. So the government needs to generate more revenue to try to make up for this shortfall. So it tries to do this by passing taxes on tobacco, taxes on fuel. There's fuel taxes again. Um, but they also tried to pass new taxes on voice over internet protocol communication services. That's VoIP. I think that's what VoIP stands for. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Um, but they tried to pass a tax on VoIP communication services, and the key case in point was I think WeChat is what it's called. One of the main forms of communication in Lebanon, and that was really what broke people. The people in Lebanon were already very upset about the inflation. They were upset about government corruption. They were upset about the government's inability to deal with the problem. Certainly the taxes were upsetting, but the fact that the government would try to tax WeChat really pushed people over the edge. And the comment that I read was that WeChat was one of the few things in Lebanon that actually worked. So the idea that the government would tax it just seemed outrageous. So it just felt to a lot of Lebanese, from what I've read, like overreach on the part of the government. And that just was on top of years of disenchantment with the government's performance in general. So that's when the protests really broke out and got started. So just to give you an idea of the health of the Lebanese economy at the time, and the degree to which the tax increases, and the inflation were exacerbating pre-existing issues. Some of those pre-existing issues included 25% unemployment, including 36% youth unemployment, which is very high. 27% of the population is under the poverty line. Debt to GDP ratio is 150%. Mind you, 100% thereabouts is roughly the red flag point. That's pretty much the threshold beyond which financial markets start getting really wary about lending to you. There's also 1 million some Syrian refugees in Lebanon, which is a big problem for the government since those people need assistance. The government has to help pay for refugee camps, etc. So that's stressing finances as well as the local economy, since you have a whole shit ton of new workers entering the market, which can have an effect on wages. And also the aforementioned poor public services. So to give you an idea of the problems that Lebanese face with poor public services, some of the problems include daily power cuts, which would be super annoying, as you can imagine, but is also problematic if you have a manufacturing, a factory of some kind. If you produce something, you need electricity to power your equipment. So if you have intermittent power cuts, that can really screw with your timetable. The result generally for a lot of people is that they just have to buy lots of generators to have available as a backup. So let's see, daily power cuts, a lack of safe drinking water, absent public health care. There's not Lebanon is kind of a poor country, so not a whole lot of healthcare support there. And also finally here, intermittent and weak internet connections. So that's not great for Lebanon's tech sector or for people who need or rely on the internet.
Or the
so
gaming
all of those,
scene.
Huh?
Or the gaming scene.
Well, yeah, that too. It's probably not a whole lot of Twitch streamers out of Lebanon. But all of those are public services, and all of them have somewhat subpar delivery in Lebanon. Delivery and management, I should say. So that's a look at the Lebanese economy and how it contributed here to the crisis. So to give you an idea of what's been happening since then, Prime Minister Hariri, this is a different Hariri. This Prime Minister Hariri is actually the son of the other Hariri who was assassinated back in 2004 or so. He kind of came to power after his father died. A lot of the political parties are pretty nepotistic, if that's a word.
Well, you're referencing nepotism, so you're favoring the next generation, your direct line.
Yeah. They basically just gave the party to him, so he was like you say, next in line. So Prime Minister Hariri steps down. He he wanted to take steps to de-escalate. That was sort of his response to the protests. I think a lot of political parties in Lebanon have kind of struggled to really coherently respond to a challenge that is not really sectarian in nature. Broad segments of the Lebanese public are supporting the protests, and as a result, there's not really an easy way for sectarian political parties to kind of play the sectarian card to try to create divisions among them or otherwise buy them off. So some of the concessions so far, lower pay for politicians, that was an easy one, but also doesn't really mean much. They also repealed the WeChat tax, or more accurately, the VoIP tax. The government also promised to reform the economy to get the promised aid. That was the, 11 billion some dollars in aid that was still on the table. So in order to get that, they had to promise new taxes on banks in order to raise revenue, and they also had to cut the deficit in their 2020 budget to 0.6%, which was down from 7% in 2019. Pretty significant fall there. It's not easy to make big adjustments like that politically, so it's kind of helpful to have a big crisis that you can say, hey, I have no choice. Otherwise, people are going to eat you alive for cutting the budget like that, or for raising taxes like that, for that matter. Hezbollah, like I think most of the institutional parties in Lebanon, opposes the protests, but they've been particularly vociferous. The leader of Hezbollah, I don't have his name, but the leader of Hezbollah argues that the protests are foreign supported. That's pretty normal card to play, pretty much. In the Middle East, it's pretty common to see the opponent being accused of being a foreign agent of some kind. Hezbollah has also attacked at least one protester camp. There's been some violence. Party thugs come out, push people around, violently attack people, try to disrupt the protests and whatnot. So that kind of brings us to the present. I haven't updated this in a while, so there might have been more recent events, but roughly this is where we are with the protests ongoing and with the establishment political parties kind of struggling to really substantively respond. And, to kind of comment on that, it's not really clear just what can resolve Lebanon's problems. The kind of problems Lebanon has are just inherently difficult to solve. Because of the country's instability, it's seen as a risky investment. So, it's just hard to resolve that, dangerous neighborhood. It's a dangerous region in general, and Hezbollah, being an officially recognized terrorist group and being the principal power in Lebanon, all of that kind of does not really help Lebanon's image as a secure place to put investment. Also, Lebanon's economy is probably a little too dependent on tourism, which is, you can develop an economy with tourism to a degree, but it's not a great pathway, and it definitely comes with problems. So that's not really a great economic driver for them. Also, it's just, culturally speaking, in terms of political culture, it's really difficult to fight patronage politics. Even if you can get people upset at the government and get them protesting, sometimes the solution to that for the protesters is not liberalized governance, good governance, best practices. For a lot of times, it's just the government redistributing patronage resources to encompass them. Before they were left out, but now they protested, so now they get paid off, and then maybe that takes the wind out of the protests, or even gets rid of it completely. Just at a cultural level, it's just really difficult to handle political corruption. That's just a very thorny issue. Also, the government doesn't really do anything to inculcate a positive business environment in Lebanon. The attitude of the government in Lebanon historically has apparently been to treat the private sector like a source of revenue rather than as an organic entity that needs to be cultivated. So for that reason, that also contributes to Lebanon not being the most attractive investment target. So let's see. One thing they could do is to implement some deeper free market reforms to facilitate that kind of pro-business climate. But managing fiscal health, that by itself isn't really going to be enough. They're going to have to probably do more. Corruption is the main thing, really at the root of the problem. For public services and the economy, that's holding back the economy writ large, and that's again a cultural thing that's hard to unwind. And I already talked about the garbage collection thing. So I think it may be that they can, that is to say, the political parties, they may just try to buy off the opposition, the protests, rather. But I think part of the problem, and really part of the problem that led to this point, is that there's only so much money that you can use on patronage. There's only so many tax dollars in the economy that you can use for patronage. And as patronage networks have shrunk relative to the population, Lebanon is a very young population with a lot of young people. So a lot of those people just have no vested interest in established patronage networks. So that being the case, it's going to be really hard for them to just buy them off, I think. So it's possible that they'll try. Maybe they'll just water down the amount of money that's going to individual people to try to spread it more thinly, and that does the trick. But really, that just kicks the can down the road, since Lebanon's population is still growing relatively rapidly, I think. So I think there's going to be a reckoning of some kind. That seems likely, if not in the short term, then at least the medium term, because they just can't really cannibalize the public sector much further beyond this point. Now, what that looks like, whatever that reckoning looks like, that's unclear. That's kind of the thing to watch for. How does a sectarian, patronage-plagued political system handle protests that are not themselves sectarian in nature? That's something we kind of haven't really seen before, I think. That's kind of a new thing, so it's a really interesting experiment to watch play out.
You can only bribe people so much.
So I think I went over a little bit. Or do we still have time?
We've got 9 minutes and 24 seconds.
Oh, I snuck in. Okay.
Yeah, like a boss.
Oh, now I see it. 2 hour. Okay. I forget about the Zencaster counter up here.
Yeah, today was really nice and focused. We just hit a couple zones really hard. The UK,
Yeah.
India area, Lebanon. We even got some epic lawyer versus doctor battles this time. Next time, tune in. The engineers are facing off against the bakers, surprisingly enough. Full on kickboxing in the streets.
Yeah, we'll see.
That's pretty funny.
You never know with the Middle East. Anything can happen.
They're keeping it exciting for sure.
To put it mildly, something to watch. Well, I don't know how much I can sneak in 10 minutes here, because I did have some stuff on Bolivia. Bolivia has been interesting to watch. The government was de facto overthrown, but the debate right now is whether or not it was a coup. So there's some question about that. I was a little skeptical it was a coup at first, but I've been kind of following it since then, and it's starting to feel a little bit more coup-y to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got some notes on that could be interesting to go through here. It's an interesting discussion, I think, if nothing else. But I don't think you can really conclusively say either that it was necessarily a coup. I don't really think it qualifies technically as a coup, but it does seem like there was an attempt to really exploit discontent with the Morales administration in order to have a change in government. But we can kind of get into that next time if we have time.
Sounds good. I appreciate your
Cool.
time very much, sir.
Oh, I appreciate you having me. It's always fun.
Nice session as always. We're probably on episode like 60 something now.
Probably 60 something. Sounds about right.
Do you have any cool holiday plans?
Not really. Christmas dinner with the family and try to finish the podcast. I think I'm on episode 7. I posted episode 7, so I've got 3 more to go, and then I'll have all 10 up, and then the damn thing will finally be done. But other than that, no substantive plans, I don't think. What about you?
I always look forward to the waffles with strawberries and whipped cream. That's what we have for Christmas breakfast.
There you go. That sounds good.
Yep. Well, cool, sir. I hope you have a great rest of your night. Sleep well. This will be on the podcast. Check out Agent Smith on his own podcast, the Who Is It command, for this ridiculously awesome conversational content. We don't know everything, but we do try to talk about stuff and get closer to the truth together. Until next weekend, Mr. Agent Smith, take care, keep it real, and have a good one.
You too. Thanks.
GG.